This story began with a small commotion in a beautiful old building where many people had gathered. A notary was about to read a will. The notary, an elderly man, began reading the last testament of Riella Anden Coin, a woman known across much of the world for her immense wealth and influence. To everyone's surprise, Duchess Hoson, Valeria herself, had decided to bequeath her entire incredible inheritance, including rare magical stones, to a girl who wasn't even her relative. That girl was Riella Tanar, a young woman from a poor and simple family. Even Riella had no idea why the Duchess had chosen her. Riella had spent her whole life in a small village, poor but full of warmth. She knew and loved every inhabitant, and they loved her in return. Remarkably, the village was known for its delicious, inexpensive fruits and vegetables, as well as high-quality fabric. Riella, who adored flowers, worked tirelessly in her flower shop and, on that particular day, was carrying an armful of blooms. The cheerful grocer, Mr. Carl, was the first to spot the flowers, and then Riella behind them. He greeted her warmly. Friendly and polite as always, Riella gave him a bright smile and returned the greeting. Everyone in the village regarded Riella as a hard-working girl, and she lived up to their expectations, tending to her shop with great dedication. Time flew by when she worked with plants, and she rarely felt tired. The peaceful hum of the flower shop was suddenly broken by the cheerful voice of a red-haired girl named Rena, Riella's close friend. Wanting to give Riella a break, Rena had brought along a feast of juicy, delicious food. At the sight of the dishes, Riella's mouth watered, and she gladly agreed to take a break. As the girls ate, Rena shared the latest gossip. She mentioned having seen their friend Emma at the mansion. Curious, Riella asked how Emma was doing. Rena replied that Emma had said everything was fine, but she hadn't looked it. She appeared worried and tired, despite trying to stay brave. Emma was deeply concerned for the estate's mistress, the elderly Lady Evelyn, who hadn't eaten for 2 days. Even the best doctors had given bleak predictions about her condition. Rena had to cut the conversation short, though, when her break ended and she dashed back to her own store. Left alone, Riella found herself thinking about Lady Evelyn. She had known the old woman, who had done much for the good of the village. Riella prayed for her recovery. But sadly, that very evening, the villagers were called to pay their respects. Lady Evelyn had passed away. Riella could only hope the kind lady had found peace in a better world. She began preparing flowers in remembrance. The next morning, people flocked to her shop to buy flowers for the funeral. At first, Riella charged only a small amount and sold them with a warm smile. One by one, people came. Men in hats, women with children, and each took at least a flower. A young girl even bought a whole bouquet, and after her more people followed suit, eager to show their respect. By noon, Riella had completely sold out, but the demand continued. Thinking quickly, Riella made a bold decision. She temporarily closed her shop and rushed out. When she returned, she brought back a large bouquet of beautiful lilies. This time, however, the price was much higher than before. It wasn't long before someone questioned the cost. A man accused her of trying to profit from the grief of poor villagers. But Riella stood her ground. She explained firmly that the flowers were priced that way for a reason, and she would not lower it. The man examined the flowers, trying to understand what made them so special. But he couldn't see it. And neither could the others. The customers disappeared, and Riella was left alone, knowing that the value of the flowers was invisible to everyone but her. Nearby flower sellers mocked her for the high price, but Riella ignored them. Her sadness lay elsewhere. Since childhood, she had possessed a rare gift. She could distinguish between luminous and non-luminous flowers, and the lilies she had brought back were luminous, filled with a beauty and energy far beyond what the others could perceive. Meanwhile, in a military camp set up in a secluded field, far from civilian life, a letter arrived for the Grand Duke. It was from Duchess Hoson. Along with the letter, she enclosed a mysterious flower, one that glowed softly, as though infused with magic. Back in her flower shop, Riella sat quietly, lost in memory. She remembered a day long ago, walking with her cheerful sister through the forest. That day, their mother had given them a simple task, to collect a few flowers, but not too many. It should have been easy. While her older sister eagerly gathered the brightest, most eye-catching blooms, little Riella wandered uncertainly, unsure of what to choose. Then, ahead of her, she saw a faint glow. A tiny, humble flower, barely noticeable among the others, yet it shone with a gentle light. Drawn to it, Riella knelt down to admire its glow and called her sister over excitedly. Her sister, however, was unimpressed. To her, the flower looked plain, even a little odd. She couldn't see the glow Riella was talking about and refused to pick it. Later, the two girls returned home. Riella carrying her glowing flower, and her sister holding a large and showy one. Their mother gratefully accepted both bouquets. But flowers don't last forever. Eventually she had to clear them away, only to discover, with great surprise, that Riella's small flower had not withered at all. It was still fresh and beautiful. From that moment on, she realized her youngest daughter had a unique gift for choosing flowers. But that gift came with its burdens. One day Riella came running home in tears. Alarmed, her mother comforted her and gently asked what was wrong. Sobbing, Riella explained, "Everyone lied to me. They said the flowers weren't glowing." Her mother was puzzled. She hadn't lied, and she didn't understand what her daughter meant. Through her tears, Riella confessed that she truly saw the flowers glow, even though no one else could. Her wise mother gently advised her to keep the glow a secret. "Bring those glowing flowers to me," she said. "I will always see their beauty." Riella had never forgotten that. Her mother had always been someone who comforted and believed in her, and though she was gone, Riella still held on to the hope that one day she would meet someone else who could also see the flowers' magical glow. Just then, something extraordinary broke the quiet rhythm of the village. A richly decorated carriage appeared on the dusty road, something never seen in their humble area. Riella heard the rhythmic clatter of hooves, rare in these parts, and turned to look. The magnificent carriage, drawn by a team of horses, sped down the narrow street. She stood frozen, mouth open in awe. To her astonishment, the carriage stopped, right in front of her. Villagers who were still awake gathered quickly, murmuring in disbelief. They all stared at the elaborate crest on the carriage door, instantly recognizing the symbol. It belonged to a gemstone magician, members of a powerful order famous throughout the world. No one could believe their eyes. Then from the carriage stepped an elderly woman with a commanding presence, Duchess Hoson herself. She was not only a noblewoman, but also a legendary gem magician, famous for having once defeated the black dragon Nind. Dollaria Anden coin, admired by both adults and children, had brought peace to many lives. And now she stood before them. Riella's heart pounded. Why would someone of such high status come to a place like this? Why would her carriage stop for a poor village girl? And yet the Duchess didn't glance at anyone else. With a solemn expression, she walked straight toward Riella. Meanwhile, for some reason, Duchess Hoson asked how much Riella's flowers cost. The girl was completely stunned that Hoson had spoken to her at all, and for a moment she didn't understand what was being asked. Then the Duchess, her stern expression softening into a gentle smile, repeated the question, asking again for the price of Riella's flowers. Still in disbelief that someone of such high status was speaking to her so kindly, Riella blushed deeply, unable to find her voice. The crowd around them hissed and muttered impatiently, urging Riella to hand the flowers over for free. "It's the Duchess herself asking," they whispered harshly. Pressured by the townspeople, Riella lowered her head and said humbly that she could not possibly take money from the Duchess. The flowers, she insisted, were just a small gift, nothing more. But the moment Hoson heard those words, heard that Riella was offering her flowers for free and calling them a mere trifle, her expression changed sharply. A shadow passed over her face, and she seemed suddenly angry. She glanced down at the price tag and asked, "Why does such an ordinary flower cost so much?" Echoing the same question that the villagers had asked earlier. Before, Riella had stood by her decision with quiet confidence. But now, faced with the Duchess's sharp gaze, her courage wavered. She knew all too well that anyone who couldn't see the flower's magical glow might think she was simply trying to overcharge grieving villagers. Overwhelmed, Riella closed her eyes in fear, unsure what to say or do. But then, something completely unexpected happened. The Duchess spoke again, this time not with anger, but with a calm authority that carried through the silent crowd. "This price," she said, "is far too low for flowers this beautiful." She turned to her cheerful young assistant and asked if she agreed. The assistant nodded at once, her face lit with genuine admiration. "They are worth far more," she said. A ripple of astonished gasps spread through the crowd. The same people who had scolded Riella only moments ago now stood speechless. None of them had ever imagined that anyone, let alone the Duchess, would suggest paying more for Riella's flowers than for anyone else's. Meanwhile, the Duchess gently took the flowers in her hands, breathed in their scent, and, much to everyone's shock, named a price 10 times higher than what Riella had asked. Riella, stunned, could barely comprehend the enormous value Hoson had just placed on her flowers. "The Duchess will take them all," she announced. Nia, her assistant, immediately handed Riella a check, assuring her it could be verified at any bank. Riella, overwhelmed and confused, stared blankly at the slip of paper. For a moment, it looked as though her very soul had left her body from sheer emotional overload. Seeing this, Nia gave Riella a gentle tap on the head and urged her to count the money. Still in disbelief, Riella unfolded the envelope. The check inside shimmered with a glow she had never seen before, and she had to turn away, momentarily blinded. She had never imagined earning so much money from selling her flowers. As the villagers crowded around to catch a glimpse of the check, the Duchess asked where the flowers had come from. Riella replied, a bit shyly, that she had grown them herself. Hoson raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. Sensing the doubt in her expression, Riella added quickly that she had nurtured them carefully in pots with her own hands. Suddenly, Hosang's demeanour changed. Her calm presence shifted into something sharper as she asked whether Riella always sold her flowers there. Riella nodded. "I cannot stay long," the Duchess said, her tone solemn once again. "I must visit an old friend." She turned to leave. Riella quickly bowed as deeply as she could, while the stunned villagers looked on. Moments later, the Duchess climbed into her richly adorned carriage and left for the mansion of her deceased friend, Evelyn. As soon as she disappeared from sight, all eyes turned to Riella. The villagers began to bombard her with questions about the flowers, the Duchess, and what had just happened. But Riella herself had no answers. Meanwhile, the Duchess's carriage pulled up in front of Evelyn's estate. The servants, already prepared for her arrival, led her inside to the room where Evelyn now rested, serene in a bed of white linens. Hoson approached, took her old friend's cold hand and whispered softly, "You lived a good and noble life." Then, from beneath her cloak, the Duchess drew one of Riella's glowing flowers and placed it gently in Evelyn's hands. The flower pulsed with light, brighter than before. And Hoson smiled. "She would have loved this lily," she said quietly. Glancing at the rest of the flowers nearby, the Duchess shook her head. "One of Riella's blooms is worth more than all the others combined." But she couldn't linger. there was still more to be done. She requested to be taken to Evelyn's legendary Room of Stones. As Hosang, Nia and a servant walked through the long corridor, the Duchess drifted into memory. 40 years ago, she and Evelyn had fought side by side during a brutal war. Evelyn had once told her she noticed things that even Hosang didn't see in herself. They had faced a powerful dragon that had awoken from its slumber. Evelyn had bravely drawn the beast's attention, giving Hosang the time she needed to gather her magic. Together, they had defeated it. Later, bruised and bandaged, Evelyn had sat smiling in her mansion, while Hosang, relatively uninjured, came to visit. Hoson had always been frustrated that the glory was given only to her. But Evelyn had simply said, "That's how I wanted it. Peace matters more than recognition." Now, walking into Evelyn's memory-filled home, Hosang felt the ache of loss more keenly than ever. When they arrived at the Room of Stones, the servant asked the Duchess to inspect their condition. Her son nodded and turned to Nia. "The flowers," she said. Nia hesitated, clearly reluctant. "But they're so rare," she whispered. "Are you sure you want to give them away?" Hoson's eyes narrowed. "Give them to me," she ordered. Flustered, Nia obeyed, handing them over in silence. The Duchess entered the room with reverence. To her surprise, it wasn't as dusty or gloomy as she had imagined. But one central dome stood empty. The gemstone it had once held, destroyed during battle. She remembered how Evelyn had cared deeply for that particular stone. Possel's gaze drifted to the moonstones lining the walls. They still radiated a gentle power. She approached them, praising them softly for protecting Evelyn all these years. With great care, she placed Riella's glowing flowers before them. She summoned her magic, blending it with the power of the flowers, and to her satisfaction, the stones responded. One by one, they flickered with light, then dimmed peacefully. The stones were free at last. Like Evelyn, they had earned their rest. Meanwhile, Riella found herself at the centre of gossip. Everyone around her whispered about her selling flowers to Duchess Hoson. But paying no attention to the murmurs, Riella quietly signed a notice board with an invitation to a memorial for Evelyn, an event she was organising entirely at her own expense. She turned to Rena for her opinion on the inscription. Rena liked the idea, which made Riella smile. However, Rena didn't understand why Riella would spend all the money she had earned from the flowers on this celebration. After all, she had worked hard for it. But Riella only replied that everyone had been kind to her all her life, and she simply wanted to give back. Rena didn't argue. She just asked Riella to bring more treats, since they'd be going on a picnic later. Riella's joy over spending her money meaningfully was short-lived. Soon after, Nia returned, putting on an emotional display. With teary eyes, she pleaded with Riella to accept a new payment, this time 10 times more than before. Holding out the sparkling check, she insisted that Riella make a final decision, refusing to back down. Nia offered several reasons why the girl should accept the money, but Riella hesitated, overwhelmed. She remembered how, a few days earlier, Duchess Hosong's servant had visited her with a request. Grow as many flowers as possible, and grow them entirely by herself. The servant had even taken her hands in his, trying to reassure her. Before they left, Hosong's assistant stepped in and gently pushed the servant aside. They asked if Riella had any questions, but she didn't know what to say. She found the whole situation odd. Why would the Duchess choose her, an unknown florist, instead of one of the famous names in the city? Though bursting with questions, Riella said nothing. She simply agreed to send the flowers at the appointed time and spent the following days consumed with anxiety over the responsibility. Now, as Nia stood before her again, Riella wanted to refuse the new offer. But just then, a neighbour entered her shop. Panic surged in Riella. She didn't want anyone to see the check. It would only fuel the gossip. Noticing the girl's fearful expression, Nia quickly came to her rescue. Smiling slyly, she discreetly cast a spell and handed the altered document to the curious neighbour. To Riella's shock, the man looked at it and declared it was merely an invitation to a tea party hosted by Duchess Hoson. Still confused but visibly relieved, Riella turned to Nia, who flashed her a mischievous smile and stuck out her tongue playfully, a signal that everything was under control. In that moment, Riella realized Nia was a magician. She was filled with awe and a touch of envy. Riella wasn't ready for a tea party, but Nia promised to take care of it and return to the mansion. There, she found Duchess Hoson resting in a flower garden, reading peacefully. Without turning around, the Duchess asked how things had gone. Nia, now dressed differently, bowed and said the delivery was complete and the interference had been dealt with. The Duchess smiled knowingly. The power of the rogue sapphires hasn't been used in a long time. Nia corrected her. Illusion sapphires. I drew their strength from Riella's flower. The Duchess raised an eyebrow in surprise. The sapphires had nearly been depleted, but a single flower had fully restored them. Looking fondly at her assistant, she noted, "There's more than enough greed in you." Unfazed, Nia replied, "Greed is one of the sapphire's core virtues." Then her gaze landed on the letter on the Duchess's desk. "Who's that for?" she asked. "For Archduke Haun," Hoson replied. Nia immediately grimaced. She hated that man and couldn't understand why the Duchess had anything to do with someone like him. Horsek, smiling at the girl's reaction, reminded her gently to choose her words more carefully. Still, Nia grumbled for a while before finally settling down, though she remained visibly upset. Archduke Haun, 25th brother of the king, was the strongest stonemancer of the century. He wielded the onyx of vengeance, a cruel and temperamental gem. His strength was such that he had once single-handedly subdued a dragon before it could emerge from its underground lair. But none of this impressed Nia. She didn't care about Huan's achievements. Then a thought occurred to Hoson, and she smiled to herself. "I feel like playing with Huan." Nia perked up instantly. She had always dreamed of ruining the Archduke's life. The Duchess nodded. "Remember, I promised him my stone chamber." Nia gasped in protest. "You're not allowed to leave this world yet." But Hoson remained calm. At 82, she felt she had lived a good life. Nia, however, began to shout. She insisted the Duchess could live for many more years and manage her affairs just as well. After all, Huan had only taken over the northern front to ease her burdens and had somehow managed to handle both the western and southern fronts too. An unprecedented feat. But the reason for all of Huan's efforts was clear. Duchess Hoson. He wanted her to retire so he could finally take her place. 5 years ago, they had made a pact. In exchange for managing her responsibilities, Hoson would one day bequeath her stones to him. That promise still held. Sighing, the Duchess ended her recollection. She turned to Nia and asked, "When is the dragon fad expected to fall asleep?" 2 months, Nia replied, though she added that Huan's recent victories might have accelerated the timeline. The Duchess considered this. She had every reason to follow through on her promise to the Archduke. But then her gaze landed on the glowing flowers Riella had given her. She said nothing, but a new idea began to form. Without explaining, she declared, "We'll finish for today, let's rest." Meanwhile, on the northern front, the gem majors sat in a circle, resting after another battle. The Stonemancers chatted about the latest gossip, including that the dragon fleet had gone into hibernation, and that Archduke Han was trying to decipher what Duchess Hoson wanted from him, especially since she'd unexpectedly asked in a letter whether he had a girlfriend. Han grumbled to himself. First, the Duchess asked him to take her place on the battlefield, and now she was inquiring about his love life. He reread the letter several times, searching for hidden meaning, but found none. The next morning, Riella rode a carriage to Duchess Hosang's tea party, her heart pounding with nervous excitement. She was beautifully dressed and held a single glowing flower, a rare bloom that only appeared once every few decades. Though small, it was her chosen gift, one she hoped would be meaningful. Buying something with money felt inappropriate. She hoped that her flower, grown with love and care, would suffice. Upon arrival at the mansion, a gallant and impeccably dressed servant greeted her and politely asked her to wait. Riella found herself in an opulent drawing room, filled with an overwhelming spread of sweets and richly decorated shelves. The luxury made her nervous, so much so that she hardly dared to move. She questioned once again why a noble like Duchess Hoson would invite someone like her. Just as she considered leaving to fetch a better gift, a sudden, piercing scream echoed through the hall. Though Riella knew it was impolite to eavesdrop, her curiosity got the better of her, and she leaned toward the door. At that moment, the door burst open. Mrs. Camilla, the source of the shouting, stormed in and accidentally struck Riella, who had been listening at the door. Camilla's face twisted in disgust at the sight of the unfamiliar, plainly dressed girl. Riella, now sitting on the floor and clutching her flower pot, rubbed her aching head. Camilla, full of fury, demanded Riella be removed, along with her dusty pot. But the butler intervened, informing her that Riella was an official guest of the Duchess. Camilla refused to believe it. She leaned in close and demanded Riella identify herself. Calmly, Riella explained that she had received an invitation to the tea party. Camilla scoffed, mocking the very idea that someone so poor would be invited. She called Riella a liar and even accused her of begging from the Duchess. Her scorn turned to the flower. She laughed cruelly at it, calling it a pathetic gift in a cheap pot. Riella remained silent, thinking only how cruel and groundless this stranger's ridicule was. When Camilla began poking her aggressively, Riella asked her to stop. But Camilla only pushed harder. The pot slipped from Riella's hands and shattered, scattering soil and the delicate flower across the floor. Devastated, Riella knelt over the broken pot, desperately trying not to cry. Then, silence fell. Duchess Hoson stood at the threshold, impeccably dressed, her face like thunder. Camilla, who just moments before had been spitting venom, instantly transformed into a sweet and humble lady. She bowed gracefully, introduced herself, and claimed she had come to deliver the Soria stone to the Duchess, and had been waiting all morning. But Hoson said nothing. She stared at Camilla with icy fury. The silence grew thick. Riella, mortified by the broken flower and the mess on the floor, assumed the Duchess was angry at her. She quickly knelt and began cleaning the dirt, hoping to fix her mistake. Her heart ached when she saw the flower, crushed and wilting, but the roots were intact. Perhaps it could be saved. Hosang's cold voice broke the silence. She turned to her assistant, Nia, and demanded to know why a guest had been treated so shamefully and why the flower was broken. Then she ordered Camilla to be punished. Camilla tried to defend herself, but it was too late. Nia charged at her. One blow from the magician assistant sent Camilla flying several meters. Enraged, Camilla retaliated with a spell, demanding Nia move aside. But Nia refused. Her pride had been wounded and she would not back down. Magic clashed violently. A massive explosion rocked the room and dust clouded the air. Riella, nearly engulfed by the blast, shielded herself instinctively. When the dust settled, she realized she'd been protected by a magical barrier. One created by Duchess. Turning to Riella, the Duchess offered a sincere apology for the chaos. She explained that her 2 stonemancer assistants had gotten carried away. Riella was speechless, overwhelmed by how easily the Duchess had protected her, even saving the butler. Meanwhile, Nia was finishing her game with Camilla, who was clearly no match for her in stonemancy. Lifting gracefully into the air, Nia soared over Camilla and effortlessly blocked another of her attacks. Enraged by this display, Camilla shouted curses, her voice shrill with frustration. "To put an end to the commotion," Duchess Hoson spoke sharply, ordering her assistant to finish things quickly. Obediently, Nia gathered her full strength and unleashed a concentrated surge of energy at the arrogant Camilla. The mistress stood no chance. She collapsed, unconscious, and the butler quietly assured everyone that she would be sent home immediately. With the disruption over, Hoson turned to Riella and invited her to sit at the table. She asked gently if the girl had been frightened. Riella tried to insist she was fine, but her trembling hands betrayed her. Watching her, Nia grumbled that she would have ended things with one blow if she'd known Riella would be so scared. Still, Riella put on a brave face and insisted again that everything was okay, which earned her soft smiles from both Nia and Hoson. With a sigh, the Duchess apologized for the chaos and expressed regret over the damage to Riella's gift. But Riella, ever kind, began consoling everyone instead, assuring them that she would bring a sturdier, more thoughtful gift next time. Nia, smiling mysteriously, remarked that she knew Riella would say something like that. Then she stepped aside to reveal something unexpected. The flower, whole and undamaged, back in its pot. Riella gasped in surprise, barely believing her eyes. She quickly realized that this miracle had something to do with the power of the stones. Hoson nodded and explained that Nia had used the rovra, a restoration stone capable of repairing small damages. Lifting a teacup to her lips, the Duchess added that glowing Riella flowers, like the one Riella had brought, could greatly enhance the stone's power, sometimes even beyond the physical space they occupied. Stunned, Riella processed this new information. Then a thought struck her. Did the Duchess also see the glow in the flowers? Hoson confirmed with a slight smile and suggested they move to the garden for a longer conversation. In the fragrant garden, surrounded by lush greenery, Riella spoke openly about how she'd begun to see light in flowers and how she had kept this strange ability to herself. She explained how much she'd hoped the flower she brought would please the Duchess. Hoson listened intently, then spoke solemnly. That kind of flower should not be consumed. Confused, Riella asked what she meant. Instead of answering directly, Hoson asked Riella how much she knew about stone-mancers and their stones. Riella mentioned the famous battle with the dragon Neon, which she had read about in the newspapers, and also spoke of the Archduke's struggles. The Duchess nodded. Riella's knowledge of the basics was solid. She then explained that all stones have different properties and limited energy. Their power is not infinite, and once depleted, a stone can fall into hibernation. To illustrate, Hoson used Nia's illusion stone and conjured a magical display for Riella. A breathtaking vision so realistic that Riella reached out and touched one of the butterflies fluttering nearby. But as the stone's energy was exhausted, the illusion faded, and the stone became dormant. Curious, Riella asked how Nia had used the stone earlier, if it was already asleep. Hoson explained honestly, glowing flowers like the one Riella had brought could awaken even sleeping stones. Originally, such flowers were extremely rare and dim, but now Riella's glowed brighter than any seen before. Realizing the implications, Riella asked if it was possible to awaken all dormant stones using these flowers. But then a shadow crossed her face. What would happen if others learned how to grow them? Would she be imprisoned or forced to grow them forever? To her surprise, Hoson was taken aback. She asked why Riella wasn't trying to profit from such a valuable ability. Riella admitted she was afraid of being locked away and used. Quietly, the Duchess admitted that she was tempted by the flowers, but locking someone away to grow them was far too cruel. She had no intention of doing that. Relieved, Riella exhaled deeply. She wasn't in danger. She could continue her life freely. Finally, Hoson said with a small smile that she'd like to be friends with Riella, but their paths in life were too different. Then, out of nowhere, she asked, "Do you have a boyfriend?" Riella blinked, completely thrown by the question. After everything that had just been said, she didn't even know how to answer. Meanwhile, Archduke Haun had just returned to his mansion from the front lines, exhausted and longing for some rest. The battles had taken a toll on him. But so had the endless visits in the capital, where every nobleman seemed to arrive with the same goal, to marry off his daughter to the Archduke. Han, however, had no interest in marriage. He cursed his own prestigious lineage, which had turned him into one of the kingdom's most eligible bachelors, even though he had long since renounced his claim to the throne. Still, the fathers remained relentless. In Han's mind, the political matchmaking felt more draining than the battlefield itself. As he brooded, the door suddenly burst open. His younger brother, grinning ear to ear, had arrived. Having heard rumours that the Archduke was reconsidering the throne, the brother playfully accused him of treason. He dropped into a chair and, still teasing, said that if Han really wanted the throne, he should say so directly. Han grimaced and waved the idea away with disdain, declaring that he wouldn't take the throne even if it were handed to him. His brother was surprised Han had even returned to the mansion, but he welcomed it, since he had business to discuss. The topic soon turned to the dragon Flyard, who had unexpectedly fallen into Slima much earlier than anticipated. Han was intrigued, and his brother looked pleased. It meant they could continue developing the northern region. Just as the prince was about to say more, he stopped mid-sentence. Han, sensing hesitation, impatiently urged him to speak. With some reluctance, his brother asked whether it was time for Han to finally settle in the capital, at least while he still had the freedom to travel. Han instantly understood what he meant. "I'm not getting married," he said flatly. He found it almost absurd that his personal life had become a matter of national concern. His brother explained that their mother had sent him to check in on Han and to see if he had anyone in mind. Han sighed and asked him to stop with the interrogation. He didn't even have a romantic interest, let alone plans for marriage. But as he firmly declared his refusal to wed, Han couldn't help but wonder, what kind of person would it even be to fall in love with? He'd read too many stories of entire nations crumbling under the weight of foolish, blind love. The idea seemed dangerous. Just then, a letter caught his eye on the desk. Picking it up, he realized it was a love letter, clearly not meant for him. He scowled and barked at the assistant, demanding to know if this was what a report was supposed to look like. The assistant, flustered and embarrassed, quickly snatched it back, apologizing profusely and promising not to mix up documents again. Han remained irritated, though more with himself than anyone else. The assistant was clumsy, yes, but unfortunately irreplaceable. Finally, unable to keep it in, Han declared loudly to everyone present that he had no intention of starting any kind of romantic relationship. At the same time, Duchess Hosang's assistant, Nia, had decided to visit Riella, whom she had come to consider a friend. Riella was delighted to see her, even if the visit momentarily pulled her away from work. Nia noticed Riella struggling to move the large notice board and, to her surprise, effortlessly lifted it on her own. "Where do you want it?" she asked cheerfully. Riella blinked, assuming the feat was due to the power of stones. But Nia laughed and said it was all her own strength. Amazed, Riella thanked her and Nia offered to help with anything else she might need. As the two worked together in the flower shop, Nia reminded her that they still had to head to the mansion soon. Once their tasks were complete, the two girls climbed into the carriage and set off for Duchess Hosang's estate. A month had already passed since Riella met Hosang and received permission to come to the garden to care for the plants. It had all begun when the Duchess was once brought a batch of flowers in poor condition. While the servants looked on in dismay, Riella confidently offered to revive them. Unbothered by their state, she enthusiastically asked that the plants be given to her. The Duchess considered the request, and Riella promised to return every flower in good condition. Hosang allowed Riella to take the flowers for their recovery, which made the girl extremely happy. But that wasn't all. The servant soon showed her even more flowers in need of care. At every new delivery, Riella gazed at the wilted plants with greedy determination and begged to take them all. Eventually, Riella found herself standing before a mountain of flowers needing restoration. Though glad she had no idea how to transport them, seeing this, the Duchess proposed a better solution. Riella could simply come to the garden and tend to the flowers there. Josang added that she would be happy to have someone care for the plants, and Riella eagerly agreed, promising to do her best. Then, unexpectedly, Hosang asked Riella for another favour, to help write letters. Riella immediately agreed. The Duchess was pleased. Having someone to handle correspondence would greatly simplify her life. The next morning, Archduke Han returned to his office after a grueling night at work. Without much thought, he tossed his jacket onto the sofa and began sifting through his letters. Among them was one from Duchess Hosang. He always read her letters immediately, though often they left him confused. From the first few lines, he realized this one was stranger than usual. The letter spoke of a beautiful new tree in the Duchess's garden, a pond with lotus flowers in the greenhouse, kittens, and even crows. None of it made sense, and to Han it seemed more like poetic nonsense than an actual message. Even the handwriting was unfamiliar. Still, he was certain it came from the Duchess's estate. Han read on, hoping it was a code. The letter ended with a warm request for him to take care of himself. That gave him pause. Then came the postscript. Hosang's eyesight had deteriorated, so someone else would be writing her letters from now on. Han realized immediately it wasn't Nia. She wouldn't have even tried to write something like this. But apart from Nia, Han didn't know anyone else in the Duchess's mansion who might have written it. That same day, the new letter writer, Riella, visited a kind woman known for baking delicious buns. The cook warmly welcomed her and proudly presented her culinary creations. Riella admired the treats, and when the cook suggested she bring some along for tea with the Duchess, she gladly agreed. When Riella arrived, the Duchess greeted her warmly and again asked for help writing a letter. Riella asked if it should be like before, just writing about anything, and Hosang nodded. After enjoying tea together, Riella set to work. She tried to picture the person receiving the letter. Imagining an older man so immersed in writing she didn't notice when lunchtime arrived. A maid brought black tea and soft buns, and Riella eagerly took a break. The aroma was so tempting that even the Duchess joined her. The maid described each delicacy in detail, and Riella tasted them with delight, feeling like she was eating the food of the gods. In all seriousness, she turned to the cook and asked her to marry her, prompting laughter from everyone. Then she begged to be adopted instead, just to keep eating the treats. Hosang and Nia chuckled, watching Riella's endless energy. That evening, Archduke Han visited one of his military camps to assess the situation. While discussing matters, he received another letter from Duchess Hosang. His subordinates remarked on how frequently she wrote to him lately. Han quietly took the letter and retreated to his tent, where he made himself comfortable and opened it. This letter described delicious cheese buns recently baked at the Duchess's mansion. Reading about such peaceful domestic life made Han smile. It felt worlds apart from the front lines. That night, he fell asleep early, and his assistant quietly made sure no one disturbed him. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, the Duchess called for her assistant to help her to bed. Naya came immediately. Behind them, two maids whispered about Hosang's worsening health. The next morning brought a flurry of activity in the kitchen. Everyone praised Madame Melda's baking. The same buns Riella had adored. Despite the compliments, Melda remained humble, hoping only that the Duchess would enjoy the food. Many noticed that Hassan had become cheerier thanks to Riella's presence. Yet beneath the surface there was unspoken concern. The Duchess's time was running short. Everyone feared that if she passed without an heir, the mansion would fall prey to the greedy stonemancers. The Duchess, aware of her fading strength, felt protective of Riella and didn't want her entangled in future conflict. One night, Hosang suddenly woke. Nia, who was nearby, noticed right away. The Duchess asked if anything had happened, but all was quiet. Nia shared that Riella was doing well with the flowers, and a letter had arrived from Han. Hosang asked for it to be brought and for the lights to be brightened, but Nia hesitated, explaining the lamp was already as bright as ever. The Duchess understood. Her eyesight was nearly gone. She smiled gently, accepting what was to come. Nia began reading the letter aloud, but soon suspected it wasn't written by Han. Still, she read on, adding her own sarcastic commentary. Han had written that he hoped to return to the capital soon and that he wished the Duchess well. Nia pouted at his early return, but Hosang only chuckled. Then the old woman wondered aloud, what if she changed her will? Nia lit up, begging her not to let Han inherit anything, just to see his shocked expression. The Duchess didn't promise anything, but drifted into memories of Han's childhood. She remembered how he used to cry in frustration when he couldn't win their sword fights, vowing to grow stronger. Eventually he disappeared from the mansion, dedicating himself to becoming powerful. The Duchess hadn't seen him for years. She missed him, though she couldn't change who he had become. Only she truly understood the reason behind his tireless effort. Now, lying in bed, the Duchess knew her final lesson for Han would be the most important. She summoned Nia and asked her to call the lawyers. It was time to make a will. She also requested that Riella not be invited to the mansion for a month while the legal affairs were handled. The next morning, Riella waited anxiously at the gate. She hadn't been allowed in the mansion for a month. She remembered the day Nia came and gently told her she could only visit the greenhouse for now. Riella had worried she'd done something wrong, but Nia couldn't explain, though Riella guessed the truth. Her days without the Duchess were quiet and dull. Eventually she learned from another gardener that Hosang had been meeting with lawyers and allowing no one inside. A few weeks later the summons finally came. When Riella entered, she was startled by the Duchess's condition. Hosang greeted her with a weak smile, glad to see her. Her eyesight was nearly gone now. She could only tell Riella was crying by the sound of her voice. The girl wept openly, heartbroken to see the once strong woman so frail. Riella eventually calmed down and apologized to the Duchess for her outburst, explaining that she hadn't meant to cry. In response, Hosang also apologized, realizing how worried the girl must have been during the long silence. With a soft smile, she invited Riella to spend as much time with her as possible. The girl agreed at once. Nia, who had been quietly watching from the side, remained silent but looked visibly saddened. Soon after, Riella was given a room in the mansion, not far from the Duchess's own chambers. Though she worried that her presence might be a burden, her desire to be close to Hosang outweighed her concerns. She decided to stay. While Riella sipped her tea, the Duchess continued her work with the lawyers, avoiding contact with anyone else for the time being. Watching the endless discussions, Riella concluded that lawyers were unbearable and hoped never to deal with them herself. The lawyers, for their part, assured her they had no desire to exhaust the Duchess, but they had little choice. That evening, Hosang invited Riella for another conversation and began sharing stories from her past. Riella listened attentively. When the Duchess struggled to recall where they'd left off last time, she began to guess. Riella playfully pretended to be offended, but quickly reassured her, not wanting to cause worry. Hosang was genuinely surprised by the girl's teasing, something she hadn't experienced in a long time. And her smile, rare and sincere, revealed how much she appreciated it. Encouraged, Riella began to share a story of her own. It wasn't about dragons or magic stones like Hosang's usual tales, but the Duchess enjoyed it all the same. Over time, Riella learned that in her youth, Hosang had been quite headstrong, stubborn to a fault according to her stories. If she wanted to step onto land she didn't own, she'd simply buy it. It shocked newcomers, but her servants were used to it. Through such means, she had greatly expanded her family's inherited lands. Riella found these stories far more interesting than her own. though she never said so aloud. One evening, Riella noticed how late it had gotten and stood to leave. When the Duchess didn't stop her, she smiled and wished the older woman good night, offering to clear the teacups herself. But instead of the usual farewell, Hoson gently told her to rest well. That night, Riella lay in bed, feeling a strange melancholy and anxiety she couldn't explain. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the Duchess, but she tried not to dwell on it. The next morning, Riella overslept. She rushed to get dressed and was still adjusting her clothes when Nia entered, dressed entirely in black. She calmly announced that the Duchess had passed away. Riella froze. The words didn't register. She couldn't speak or process anything else Nia said, lost in a blur of memories. To bring her back to reality, Nia took her hands and told her she was required to be present for the reading of the will. Still overwhelmed, Riella barely understood what was happening. Nia then handed her the Duchess's bracelet, saying it would protect her from most magical threats. But Riella couldn't take in the meaning. She felt like she was suffocating, yet unable to help herself. Nia understood. She didn't press her further. She knew the girl simply needed time. The night before, sensing her end was near, the Duchess had spoken of Riella with deep concern. She also sighed about Han, knowing he would be angry about her will, but she had no plans to change it. Instead, she turned her attention to Nia. Hoson said quietly that having Nia by her side all these years was the best decision she had ever made in her long, turbulent life. Nia, unable to hold back any longer, wept silently. She took her mistress's hand, treasuring the warmth one last time, and cried for the woman who had meant so much to her. Now, the emotional storm had passed, and Nia was composed again, ready for what came next. As she and Riella walked through the hall, Nia gave quiet instructions, aware of how the girl's life was about to change. When they entered the main hall, Nia told Riella to trust the Duchess no matter what happened. But Riella wasn't frightened by her words. What unsettled her was the way the people, seeing her for the first time, began whispering in disapproval. Soon the lawyers arrived, and the atmosphere shifted as everyone turned their attention to them. The notary, who was to read out the Duchess's will, asked for everyone's focus before proceeding. Once he had confirmation, he began reading slowly, following all the proper protocols. As the notary read, Riella's mind wandered. She wondered how much longer she needed to stay, feeling out of place. The elderly man followed the rules meticulously, reading each word carefully, which only seemed to heighten the anticipation in the room. The guests, aware of the Duchess's vast wealth, anxiously waited, hoping to receive even a portion of it. Amid the proceedings, Riella's thoughts kept drifting to the Duchess, and a wave of sadness washed over her. She struggled to hide it, wishing to remain composed. As the notary reached the financial details, Riella could hardly focus her thoughts elsewhere. Just as she was about to leave, Nia gently grabbed her hand, asking her to stay. Reluctantly, Riella returned to her seat, still feeling disconnected. Then the notary announced that the Duchess had bequeathed all her property to one person. A stir rippled through the room. The guests were shocked. None of them had anticipated such an outcome. The whispers started almost immediately, everyone hoping the inheritance would be theirs and not someone else's. The notary tried to quiet the room, but the excitement was palpable. When the noise finally died down, he continued, revealing that the entire inheritance was to go to Riella. Riella froze. A deep fear gripped her. Surely there had been a mistake. As the people around her began to murmur indignantly, some questioning how someone like her could be the sole beneficiary, Riella's heart raced. One man even started a rumor, claiming that the stones were meant for Archduke Haun, not Riella. In the chaos, Riella remained silent, hidden in her own fear, grateful that no one seemed to notice her too closely. But then, one of the men recognized the bracelet Riella was wearing, the same arm-felt pearls that had belonged to the Duchess. He called out, and everyone turned to look. The loudest of the voices from earlier immediately demanded to know where Riella had gotten the bracelet. It became clear that she was indeed the one who had inherited everything. People started whispering and eyeing her suspiciously. Nia quickly came to Riella's side, hugging her and urging her to ignore the crowd. With a sharp glare, Nia silenced the room, and everyone instinctively stepped back, unnerved by her intensity. One man huffed in displeasure, but soon turned away. Meanwhile, in the mansion of Archduke Haun, the servants were in turmoil. They had been searching for their master, worried about his well-being. Haun's youngest assistant was nearly in tears, asking if the master was truly alive. Others, accustomed to his long absences, grumbled at the fuss. Just as they were about to spiral into panic, the door opened, and Archduke Han entered, unbothered. He explained that he had left a note, but the servants were still concerned, especially since he had been in the dragon's lair, a place known for being dangerous. Seated at the table, Han was handed a pile of letters, and upon reading one, he learned that the Duchess had passed away 4 days earlier. He was shocked, especially since he had expected to see her again. The letters also revealed that all of her property was to be inherited by a girl named Riella, a name he hadn't heard before. Intrigued, he decided to find out who she was and why everything had gone to her. The next morning, Nia knocked on Riella's door. When she received no response, she entered. Riella had a busy day ahead, and Nia had hoped to wake her early. As she approached the bed, she heard Riella whispering the Duchess's name in her sleep, tears slipping down her face. Nia, feeling a pang of sadness herself, hesitated for a moment, missing the Duchess too. But there was no time to mourn. Nia quickly woke Riella, noticing her swollen eyes from crying. After comforting her, Nia hurriedly prepared Riella for the day, sending her to breakfast before emotions could overwhelm her again. The hearty meal helped revitalize Riella, and she felt a little better, ready to face the challenges ahead. At the breakfast table, a pile of papers was placed before Riella, detailing her newfound inheritance. The lawyers explained that it would be impossible to go through everything at once, so they recommended reading it gradually. Meanwhile, Nia and the butlers had managed to deal with the disgruntled guests, sending them away after the will was read. But for Riella, the real challenge had just begun. The inheritance wasn't just limited to the mansion. It included wheat fields, farms with livestock, and the vast surrounding territory. There were also jewels, money, and magical stones. The sheer scale of it all was overwhelming, and the lawyer grew exhausted just reading through it. Riella, feeling the weight of the responsibility, hesitantly raised her hand. "Is it possible to refuse all of this?" The lawyers, visibly disheartened by her question, explained that while it was possible, refusing the inheritance would have serious consequences. It would go to the state, and many people would lose their livelihoods. Moreover, the annual event that the Duchess had financed would be cancelled, affecting countless people. Riella, now deeply worried, didn't want to cause such devastation. She had no idea what to do next. Meanwhile, the man continued to read out a list of damages that would occur if Riella refused the inheritance. The girl was terrified by the immense consequences her refusal would have in various areas. Overcome with dread, Riella sank in her chair, prompting the lawyer to pause and attempt to console her, urging her to sign the will so she could officially inherit. Realizing there was no other choice, Riella, through her tears, reluctantly signed the paper. After the lawyers left, Riella fell into despair, not wanting to sign anything. However, she resolved to manage the Duchess's affairs to the best of her ability. Still, she was deeply concerned about how to explain everything to her family. Suddenly, she remembered that the inheritance should have gone to Archduke Haun, not her. Haun was a renowned stonemancer, and his ruthless reputation often made headlines. Riella feared that Han might try to kill her out of jealousy, since she had received everything, even though he was the rightful heir to the stones. Despite her trepidation, she wasn't ready to lose her life. Luckily, Nia noticed Riella's distress and invited her to the greenhouse for a change of scenery. Riella, feeling awkward as she typically only entered the garden with permission, hesitated before stepping inside. She was startled to see that the flower, a gift from the Duchess, was glowing. The flower's blooming cycle spanned 2 centuries, and its sudden bloom caught Riella off guard. She felt an overwhelming sadness, knowing the Duchess would never see the flower in bloom. With tears welling in her eyes, Riella sat alone in the greenhouse, hoping that crying would provide some relief. Just then, she heard someone enter, and hastily declared that she wasn't crying. To her surprise, it wasn't Nia, but an unfamiliar man standing before her, silently observing her. They both froze, unsure of what to say. Embarrassed, Riella quickly wiped her tears, trying to hide them from the stranger. She remembered Nia's warning that no one was allowed on the estate without permission. Despite this, the man confidently asked who she was, speaking to her as if he were the owner of the manor. The man, having just returned from the front, had gone straight to his brother and reported the end of his affairs. Archduke Haun was about to leave when his brother stopped him, insisting that this wasn't part of his plan. The ruler ordered Han to return, as they needed to discuss matters concerning Duchess Hosang's inheritance. Han's brother suggested that Han should visit the Duchess's mansion, as it was possible for the king's representative to inspect the will without the heir's consent. Han, feeling satisfied with the official permission, headed toward the mansion, burning with anger over the will. He believed that Riella had deceived the ailing Duchess and somehow managed to inherit everything. However, Han couldn't understand why the Duchess's servants had been so naive. Suddenly, Han heard crying, and his suspicion grew. He frowned, thinking he couldn't believe it was Riella. But when he saw a girl sitting on the ground, her face covered in tears, he was momentarily taken aback by her appearance. Despite his discomfort, he couldn't shake the strong feeling that struck him, though he couldn't yet comprehend what it was. Han asked who the girl was, but Riella, still embarrassed, noticed the arrogance in his tone. Although it was their first encounter, she felt no fear, as she now had a right to stand her ground among the aristocracy. Before she could respond, Nia rushed into the greenhouse and shouted for Riella to move away from the stranger. Riella, surprised by his actions, asked how he could see the glow of the flower. Confused by her question, Han turned toward her, and Nia, filled with hatred for Han, confronted him. Sparks flew between them, but Riella suddenly recalled that both Nia and Han could see the flower's light. Excited, she asked the stranger his name. He introduced himself with a hint of annoyance. "I am Archduke Han Arrol Pendragon." Riella, terrified, broke into a cold sweat, recalling the ruthless rumors about him. Nia, furious at Han's proximity to Riella, made a move to strike him. Before she could, Han quickly grabbed Riella's hand, pulling her close to shield her from the potential attack. Riella, stunned by the sudden embrace, blushed but struggled to free herself. Despite her attempts to escape, Han held on tightly, worried that Nia's magic might harm her. Nia, seeing what was happening, considered attacking Han, but Han coolly stated that he would deal with her first and then talk to Riella. This declaration shocked Riella, and she feared for Nia's safety. As Han prepared to cast a spell, Riella, desperate to stop him, pushed him with all her might. But Han, unshaken, remained focused on his magic. In a split second, Riella grabbed the only thing Han cared about, the glowing flower, and threw it at him. The pot shattered, and Han lost his concentration, causing his spell to dissipate. Riella rushed to Nia's side, checking if she was okay. Nia, trying to reassure her, stopped mid-sentence when she saw Riella's face. A small but noticeable scratch marred the girl's skin, making Nia panic and call out her name in alarm. Meanwhile, Han, stunned by the events, realized that Riella had inherited everything from the late Duchess. Both girls were shaken, but Han struggled to believe that Riella, of all people, was the one to receive such an inheritance. Meanwhile, the girl touched the wound on her face with her fingers and looked at her hand, noticing the blood. Han wanted to apologize and explain everything, but Riella screamed at him to stay away. Stubbornly, and with great resolve, she declared that he should never come near Nia, even though she herself was bleeding. Riella then turned to her assistant, inspecting her closely for any injuries. Thankfully, Nia was unharmed. Han, seething with fury, was well aware that Nia wasn't just an ordinary assistant, but a dragon in disguise. At that moment, the voices of servants were heard outside the door. Hugging her assistant, Riella cried out loudly for help. The Archduke was shocked by Riella's behavior, as she stood still and did absolutely nothing while screaming for assistance. The servants rushed into the greenhouse, fully prepared for a confrontation. Upon seeing their mistress and assistant kneeling before Han, they were puzzled. Nia immediately sprang into action, declaring that the Archduke had attacked them. This accusation alarmed the servants, who were concerned for their new mistress's safety. Riella, trying to calm the situation, reassured them that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. However, when the servants noticed the blood on her face, they became enraged and turned toward Han, demanding an explanation. To Han's surprise, the man who had fought dragons without fear began to retreat under the pressure of an ordinary assistant. Meanwhile, Neo quickly took Riella into a room to heal her wound using the magic of stones. As they closed the greenhouse door behind them, Neo turned back to Han and stuck her tongue out at him, mocking his predicament. Later, Han found himself sitting in front of Riella's lawyers, forced to listen to their reprimands. They informed him that his actions had almost resulted in a serious offence by overstepping his authority as an inspector, which was unacceptable. Han only half listened, his mind preoccupied with Riella's condition. In the middle of the lawyer's next sentence, Han snapped out of his thoughts and asked what they were discussing. The lawyers, with a sigh, explained that Riella wasn't seriously hurt. Han breathed a sigh of relief, but the lawyers were frustrated, believing that he should have apologized properly. Despite their reproaches, Han remained composed and asked to speak with Riella personally, stating that he had come as an inspector. Meanwhile, Riella was seething with anger at Han for harming Nia. Though Nia remained calm, secretly pleased by the situation, she carefully treated Riella's wound. However, Riella was determined not to calm down and insisted on demanding an apology from the Archduke. Nia advised against it, especially for her own sake, as she and Han were in a deep conflict. Remembering something from the past, Nia's mood shifted and she grew quiet. The girl, overwhelmed by emotions, asked Riella for permission to leave the room and ran off. Riella, observing this, realized that Nia's reaction was likely due to Han's presence. Though she had promised herself to speak with Han for the sake of a peaceful future for Nia, she couldn't shake her fear of him. Meanwhile, Nia, having mastered her emotions, made her way to the Archduke's temporary chambers. Though she had no desire to speak with him, this was the final wish of Duchess Hoson. With politeness, Nia knocked on the door before entering the room. Han, standing with his back to her, turned around, and to her surprise he wore an apologetic expression. This only served to irritate Nia even more, as she realized she couldn't leave just yet. Seeing his assistant standing before him, Han's expression shifted to one of anger. Realizing an opportunity, the Archduke prepared to use his stones, but Nia, quick on her feet, found a way to defend herself. For now, Han was forced to refrain from taking drastic action. He clicked his tongue in frustration, calmed the stones, and turned away, asking why Nia had come. Nia, remaining calm, responded without being provoked. She tossed a moonstone to Han, revealing it to be the shadow crystal, which was the only inheritance he had received from Duchess Hoson. Han found it odd that the Duchess had not left any paperwork, but instead had handed him the stone. Curiosity piqued, he quickly realized there must be something more to it, and shook the shadow crystal to activate it. To his surprise, the image of Duchess Hoson began to materialize in front of him. When Han saw her, he was stunned by how much she had aged, remembering her as much younger. Meanwhile, the image of the Duchess created by the crystal began to speak, and Han listened intently. The Duchess expressed her joy at how upset Han seemed over the will, which only fueled his anger. The Archduke began to show his indignation, but the image of Hoson explained that she simply wanted to see him angry. This only made Han more furious as he looked at the taunting message from the already deceased Duchess. After a brief laugh, the image of the Duchess became more serious and moved on to discuss the will. Hosang explained that it was foolish for the Archduke to hope she would willingly bequeath everything to him. Instead, he should have forced her to make a decision in his favour before she met Riella. Without hesitation, the Duchess revealed that Riella had the ability to grow glowing flowers, a fact that astonished Han. However, Nia left the image to explain the rest, as the crystal's duration was running out and they needed to hurry. Hosang continued, recalling how she had devoted her entire life to working with stones, something she had no regrets about. However, when she met Riella, the Duchess fell in love with the child and realized she could pass on much of her own knowledge. That day, Hosang decided that Riella would be the last gem in her collection. The only way to protect her was to leave her all her inheritance. Han anxiously wondered what would happen if Riella met a malicious stonemancer instead of the Duchess. The Duchess then posed a question that confused Han. Why was she even telling him all of this? She explained that by looking at Nia, she realized neither the assistant nor Han himself could harm Riella. Hosang added that Nia and Han shared one thing in common, which shocked both of them. In unison, the Archduke and the girl expressed their indignation at such a statement, causing the image of the Duchess to smile. Finally, the Duchess told Han to protect the new mistress, adding that it wasn't a request, but something beneficial for him, as his reward would be all of Hosang's stones from her collection. Hearing about the moonstones, Han was surprised, as he had always thought he would never have access to them. The image of the Duchess explained that another page of the will existed, transferring all her stones to the Archduke. This page was in a protected room of stones, guarded by the moonstones themselves. The Duchess warned that the will would self-destruct in 6 months, which was not ideal for Han. The Archduke, worried about how he would obtain the stones, was left deep in thought when the Duchess's image faded away. Nia, eager to leave Han's room, quickly exited, but Riella suddenly appeared before him. She wanted to discuss what had recently happened, but Han, still emotional, wasn't listening. He stood motionless, murmuring to himself. Riella asked what he was doing, but Han, without answering, sharply turned and pressed her against the wall. He declared that he would receive all of Hosang's inheritance, including Riella. After speaking those words, Han wondered why he had said such things out loud. Before he could say anything else, Riella silently turned and walked toward the door, saying nothing. When she reached the door, she opened it, smiling angrily, and politely told Han to leave. Left with no choice, the Archduke complied and left the room. Riella then went to study with Nia, exhausted but determined to learn. During her free moment, she thought back to Han's words, which she considered selfish. However, she couldn't understand why he had restored the flower she threw at him earlier. At first he defended her, then later behaved aggressively, leaving Riella unsure of what to make of him. Suddenly, a maid burst into Riella's room, breathless, only able to say Han's name. Meanwhile, the Archduke was in his mansion, unaware of what was being said about him in Riella's mansion. He recalled the expression on her face when she had said goodbye to him, and unease crept in, though he couldn't understand the reason for his emotions. His thoughts were interrupted when the Queen decided to visit him. Han immediately greeted her politely, kneeling, and she invited him to sit. The Queen, sensing something was troubling the Archduke, asked what was bothering him. Han became embarrassed, not wanting his feelings to be so obvious. The Queen didn't offer immediate advice, but instead took a moment to sip her tea and think. After analysing the situation, the Queen suggested that Han marry Riella. Han was caught off guard and nearly choked at the idea. He didn't understand why he would marry the new mistress of the Hosang mansion. The Queen explained that the girl was beautiful and now had an excellent inheritance, specifically the stones. Ensuring that they remained with Riella was a prudent move. Though Han admitted that the Queen's words made sense, he still resisted the idea of marriage. After some thought, Han realized that the Queen was concerned enough about him that he needed to do something. His mind wandered to a public ball a few years ago when he refused to let anyone get close to him. An assistant had tried to show him some attractive girls, but he hadn't cared. Then, a girl named Steron approached him. She introduced herself as a recent graduate of the Stonemancer exam and was clearly nervous, bowing in front of him. Steron, still embarrassed, asked Han for advice on moonstones. Han sighed but allowed her to speak, causing Steron to beam with happiness. As they spoke, Steron's father watched from the sidelines, pleased by the interaction. A little later, the old man got drunk and began boasting to others that the Archduke and his daughter were getting along well, and their marriage was just around the corner. He was happy even if Han renounced the throne, as it wouldn't affect his grandchildren. Han later heard about these rumours from his faithful assistant, who had grown tired while handling the situation. Han thanked the assistant and from that point on avoided any more balls, preferring to act alone to prevent further misunderstandings. Meanwhile, the Queen reasoned that while Riella could be considered a lady, she was still a commoner. Han recalled that the right of inheritance was not granted to children born of marriages to commoners, which benefited the woman. The Queen openly admitted that she had been considering exactly this. Though she couldn't force Han to marry Riella, the king himself unexpectedly intervened in the conversation. Quietly appearing near his beloved Queen, he greeted Han before demanding a kiss on the cheek from his wife. The Queen didn't refuse and pulled him close, clearly head over heels in love with him. The Archduke had no choice but to witness this exchange, unable to voice any objections. Just then, a man burst into the room, interrupting the King and Queen's affectionate moment. He was Camille's father, and he claimed that Han had ordered his daughter to go to Riella's mansion. According to Camille herself, the Archduke had told her to open the Room of Stones, despite the Duchess Hosang's prohibitions. Meanwhile, Riella was running as fast as she could to the main hall of her mansion, where all the activity had frightened the maids. She feared something serious might be happening, and didn't even listen to the assistant who had arrived running, unaware of the full situation. In the main hall, Riella saw most of her servants gathered around, and one person was shouting at everyone, despite having no right to do so. Riella immediately recognized the voice. It was Camille's. Even before Riella had inherited all the Duchess's wealth, Camille had broken her flower. Camille stood with her back to Riella, dressed in a beautiful blue dress that suited her very well. But Riella made a point to ignore it and simply called out to her. Camille instantly turned around, her face still angry, but she softened slightly at the sight of Riella. However, she continued to demand in an insolent tone that she be taken to the Room of Stones. Riella was unmoved and reminded Camille that she had no right to enter either the Room of Stones or the mansion as a whole. In response, Camille smugly showed Riella a piece of paper, a formal document from the inspector, Archduke Han. Riella was surprised that Camille had such a document and asked to take a closer look. However, Camille quickly hid it, not allowing her to see it. Thinking she had won, Camille declared that she would open the Room of Stones in the mansion on behalf of Archduke Han. Nia, however, reminded Camille that she didn't have the right to do whatever she wanted in someone else's mansion, suggesting she should go home. This comment caused Camille to pause for a moment, muttering something under her breath instead of shouting. She locked eyes with Riella, and the atmosphere shifted. Slightly frightened, Riella considered it best to let Camille do what she wanted, especially since Nia was nearby and could intervene if necessary. Soon after, Riella led the impulsive Camille to the door of the Room of Stones, but no one was willing to go further since Duchess Hosang had specifically asked that no one enter. Camille shuddered in excitement, a joyful expression spreading across her face at the prospect of finally reaching the object she had desired for so long. But Nia stopped her, slapping her on the shoulder and scaring her, reminding everyone that only Riella could enter the room. Nia demanded that Camille take responsibility if anything went wrong. Reluctantly, Camille nodded in agreement, still desperate to get into the room. Nia wasn't done, though. She demanded that Camille provide a receipt from the lawyers, which only fueled Camille's anger. She wanted to open the door quickly, but as Camille tried to shake off Nia's grip, Riella turned to her again, wanting to ask a clarifying question. Riella asked if she could see the document from Han again, but Camille refused, stating they had already looked at it. Riella, sensing something might be wrong, didn't back down. She suggested they wait for the lawyers to notarize the document from the Archduke, but Camille, unable to wait any longer, broke free from Nia's grip and rushed toward the door, managing to open it. A blinding light immediately flooded the room, and a powerful wind erupted from the doorway, so strong that no one could stand against it. The wind was so intense that Riella was literally blown off her feet. Despite her best efforts to hold her ground, the gusts were too much to resist. With all her strength, Riella clung to the threshold, knowing that if she let go, she would be swept away. Meanwhile, objects flew around them, blown away by the force of the wind. Riella tried to understand what was happening inside the room. As she peered into the dazzling, shining light that accompanied the powerful wind, she noticed something within it that reminded her of the moonstones the Duchess had shown her. However, she had never heard of the stones working on their own like this. Meanwhile, Nia stubbornly tried to close the door and screamed at Riella to move away. But instead of obeying, Riella grew concerned about Camille and asked where she was. It turned out that Camille had almost reached the door despite the powerful gusts of wind coming directly from the center of the room of stones. With great hope on her face, Camille was reaching for something inside, but so far she hadn't been able to touch it, though she didn't stop trying. Seeing this, Nia promised to try and help, although it wasn't certain she would have the strength to pull the girl out and close the door. Riella advised Nia to start with the door, when suddenly a book flew from her hand, which she had been holding onto at the ledge. The girl's grip loosened for a moment, and for several seconds she was swept through the air. The wind held her completely off the ground, pulling her further from the door. As Riella realized how quickly she was being carried away, she understood that landing would hurt. To her surprise, however, the fall wasn't as painful as she had expected, for she landed on something soft. She then heard a man's voice asking if she was hurt. When Riella opened her eyes, she saw that she was lying on a man. She raised her head and realized it was none other than Archduke Haun himself who had saved her. Riella was surprised but didn't have time to dwell on it, quickly remembering Camille in the room of stones. She asked Haun to save her. The Archduke agreed, helped her to her feet, and told her to hold on tightly to him until he calmed the wind. Riella noticed the wind became much calmer as Haun stood in front of her, which was very reassuring. She obediently closed her eyes as he had asked. With her eyes closed, Riella could still sense the powerful wind, the roaring sound, and the light emanating from the stones in the Duchess's room. She realized that in this situation, she had no choice but to trust Haun and not doubt him. Holding on to him, she felt her hands shaking from fear, so she clung tighter to him for comfort. Haun, while protecting her, couldn't help but notice how small she was. Yet he never lost focus on his spell. Meanwhile, Camille was still struggling with Nia, trying to prevent her from closing the door, as she hadn't yet gotten what she was after. Unexpectedly, Haun walked past the two girls and told them not to interfere. In a few quick moments, the door to the room of moonstones was closed, and everyone, except Camille, felt relief. Camille, however, fell into despair at the closed door. Nia, shaking herself off, couldn't help but marvel at the Archduke's strength to withstand such a fierce wind so easily, even if it was aided by the stones. Haun then approached the defeated Camille, who had no strength left to move. He knelt before her, and noticed that Riella still had her eyes closed, pressing slightly against him. The Archduke told Riella she could open her eyes. Haun then glanced at the document Camille had brought and immediately understood the situation. Trying to keep his voice steady, he explained that forging a signature was a serious crime, and Camille had lied about having Haun's approval. Camille had no defense, since she indeed had forged the signature, so she remained silent, sitting on the floor. After a moment of waiting for a response, Haun stood up, telling Camille that the situation would be investigated and she would be held accountable. A heavy aura of tension hung around Camille, who kept her head bowed low, and no servant approached her to offer help. Only Riella noticed that Camille was quietly murmuring, "Mother," under her breath, though no one else heard it. Later, Han called a meeting of 3 people, himself, Riella, and Camille's father, as he wanted to deal with the situation. Camille's father agreed with the Archduke, admitting both his and his daughter's guilt without question. Han escalated the matter further, recalling that Camille, the minister's daughter, had forged the signature of a royal family member, a serious crime. He added that the new mistress of the mansion could have been harmed by Camille's actions, which Riella was surprised to learn Han cared about. Riella quickly explained to herself that Han must be concerned about his reputation, which made more sense to her than his concern for her well-being. However, she couldn't help but glance at him, curious to see his true emotions. When she looked, she saw more of a noble knight than a stone-hungry stonemancer. Pam suddenly asked aloud why Camille was so obsessed with the stones, especially considering rumours that this wasn't the first time she had tried to open the Room of Stones. Riella thought for a moment, remembering Camille's words and actions, and speculated that it might have something to do with Camille's mother. This assumption shocked Camille's father, who was momentarily speechless. When he recovered, he became grim, barely holding back tears, but he stayed silent. Han noticed the minister's reaction and demanded that he immediately reveal all the information. After calming his trembling hands, the minister explained that Camille didn't care about the stones locked in the room. What she wanted was one stone, one that contained memories. The moonstones recorded everything around them, and in the Duchess's room was an image crystal that held the memory of his wife, a former stonemancer. The minister apologized, his voice trembling as he recalled the past. He explained that when Camille was just 2 years old, her mother passed away due to a weak body and overexertion. The minister couldn't believe she was gone, so he collected all the crystals that contained her image. However, the images on the crystals didn't last forever. Eventually, each stone only had one reproduction of his wife's likeness. He was upset. But young Camille, who had no memory of her mother, was even more upset. One day, the minister learnt that on every anniversary, he would watch the image of his wife on the crystals. Then, one day, all the crystals disappeared. The maid told the minister that Camille had entered the room, and the man rushed there, hoping it wasn't too late. When he opened the door, he saw the image of his wife, alive, incredibly happy. The minister couldn't tear his eyes away from her smiling face, forgetting why he had entered the room in the first place. The image was so real, even reproducing her voice and scent. But then, everything stopped and the image of his wife vanished. Little Camille tried to shake the crystals and desperately begged for the image to return. The minister, realizing what had happened, looked around and saw a pile of used-up crystals on the floor, their power completely drained. Anger overtook him, and in a fit of rage he raised his hand to strike his beloved daughter. That day, the servants had to drag him away from Camille, but it was too late. Camille had already been traumatized, holding her sore cheek where her father had struck her. The minister, overcome with guilt, couldn't look his daughter in the eye. He sent her away to a distant estate for many years. As she left, Camille would often look back at the house, hoping to meet her father's gaze, but he never looked back. Years later, when Camille was fully grown, she returned to the mansion of the still-living Duchess Hoson, seeking permission to enter the Room of Stones. The minister, who had been riding in a carriage, was concerned about what his daughter might have done in the mansion. Hoson had sent him a letter stating that Camille had arrived but had not left, so the minister hurried to retrieve her. Meanwhile, Camilla stood in front of the Duchess's mansion, convinced that the woman would want to place the stones she had brought into the room. The minister hurried to call out to his daughter, and she turned around in fear, not expecting to see him there. It turned out that the minister's wife had once participated in a battle alongside Duchess Haun, which meant there was a possibility that her image was imprinted in the crystals kept in the Duchess's room of moonstones. The man explained that Camilla simply wanted to see her mother again, which was why she had become so fixated on the stones. Han, however, stated that the girl's offence was too serious and could not be justified by her father's sad story. The minister agreed with the Archduke's statement and bowed his head in shame in front of the king's brother and heiress Hosang, full of grief. He knelt down in front of Riella, intending to apologize, though he knew it wouldn't change the situation. Riella was shocked by the minister's behavior and embarrassed, as she didn't feel an apology was necessary, nor did she want to be treated this way. The girl's father acknowledged that Camilla's actions were his sin as a father and promised to try to prevent something like that from happening in the future. He didn't ask for forgiveness, but genuinely repented for what had occurred. As he sat on his knees in front of his mistress, Riella paused for a moment and suddenly asked if the crystals that contained the image of his wife and Camilla's mother were still around. The father was surprised by her question, but quickly answered that, although the crystals had lost their power, he couldn't bring himself to throw them away. These crystals were the only remaining link to his wife, even if their magic no longer worked. Without explaining herself, Riella asked if Camilla was still in the next room, and upon receiving a positive answer, she placed a glowing flower next to the discharged crystal. She asked Nia to nourish it with energy so that it would regain its power. Though Nia grumbled about helping those who had indirectly harmed Riella, she obeyed and charged the crystal. Once everything was ready, Riella tidied up the remnants of the flower and asked the minister to call Camilla into the room. Neither the father nor the daughter had any idea what Riella was up to. Camilla entered the room with suspicion, but when she saw what was inside, her doubts immediately gave way to tears of joy. In the middle of the room, the image of her mother appeared, released from the now charged crystal. The woman, dressed in a wedding gown, smiled radiantly, as if she was happy to meet her daughter again. Camilla, seeing her mother for the first time, couldn't contain her tears. The beautiful woman in front of her seemed so real, so full of life. Overcome with emotion, Camilla whispered, "Mom," over and over, then cried, even though she couldn't hold her mother in her arms. She sat next to the image, wanting to be as close as possible. The minister, seeing this, also couldn't hold back his tears. He had loved his wife dearly, and was grateful to see her again, even if it was only in this way. The only one not emotional was Han. He stood calmly, watching the tearful family reunion unfold. Once the emotion settled, the minister asked Riella why she had helped them. She replied that she couldn't leave them in such despair. Riella then requested that everyone remain silent about what had happened in the room, so no one would learn about her power. The Archduke suddenly became embarrassed, as a thought crossed his mind that he was in this situation because of the woman he loved. But he didn't want to be in love at all, and he began to offer that Riella could ask him for anything, but the girl quickly pushed the minister towards his daughter so they could talk. The father approached Camilla awkwardly, unsure how to start a conversation after so many years. Camilla, still crying, admitted that she knew she looked foolish and didn't think they needed to discuss it, but the minister didn't want to offend her. Instead, he asked for her forgiveness, which surprised the girl. He invited her back to the mansion, offering to talk more when they returned because there was too much to say. Camilla bowed her head gratefully, as she had longed to hear these words, but had never been able to communicate with her father. As Camilla turned to leave, she suddenly turned to Riella, surprising the girl. Camilla apologized for her previous misunderstandings, to which Riella quickly responded that it was fine. However, Nia grumbled, suggesting that Camilla could have apologized better after everything she had done. In the end, Camilla returned to her mansion in the arriving carriage, saying nothing else to anyone. Riella sincerely thanked the Archduke for his help, though Nia, still behind her, insisted that Riella could have handled everything herself. The lady told Han that if he ever needed anything, she would come to his aid, but it was better not to ask for anything too difficult. In response, the Archduke stated that he already had a request, and it wasn't someday, but right here and now. He asked her to prepare a room because he would be staying at Riella's mansion from that moment on. Both girls flinched. The assistant wanted to deal with the Archduke and have him leave, but Riella stopped her, reminding Nia that Han was of higher status. Han explained that he needed to stay for her safety. Even though Riella had a protector in Nia, she was forbidden from attacking people, which meant she wouldn't always be able to help. Riella tried to defend her assistant but couldn't say much, as Han's reasoning was still valid. He made the point that if anyone found out about Riella's ability, it could be disastrous for her. The girl was frightened by the possibility, but was most surprised that Han knew about her. He explained that the Duchess had told him in a separate will. Riella didn't believe it at first, so she asked Nia. The assistant confirmed that Han's words were true, leaving Riella with no choice but to allow him to stay for a while, even though she didn't want to. Later, the Archduke explained that the Duchess was sure he wouldn't harm Riella, which was why she shared information about her abilities with him. Although Riella didn't fully believe Han wouldn't take advantage of her abilities, she was more convinced by his promise. However, she insisted that Han had said any stonemancer would take the flowers, so why wouldn't he? Han explained that his only interest was in knowing which stones were in the Duchess's room. Riella was still uncertain, thinking the Archduke was taking too much upon himself after she had once accepted his help. She remembered that Han was Hoseong's successor, and the room could indeed mean a lot to him. But she wondered if there was a way to avoid giving him a room, and whether lawyers could help her with this. She looked at Han with an innocent, thoughtful expression, surprised to see him staring back at her. When their eyes met, he immediately turned away, pretending nothing had happened. Riella decided he was just worried about her ability. And Han, realizing he didn't know how to talk to girls except for business matters, became embarrassed. Riella hoped that the lawyers would help her get the Archduke out of the mansion, but to her surprise, they supported him staying. The men explained they were just concerned for her safety, leaving everything to Han. One of the lawyers even mentioned that having the Archduke in the mansion would make it easier to open the Duchess's stone room. Riella had earlier said she didn't want to open the room, which Han overheard. He became curious and explained that the risks of leaving the room closed were higher than opening it. It was better to handle it now. Riella didn't fully understand the danger, so she asked Han for clarification. He kindly explained that the stones in the room were very powerful and could easily get out of control. Over time, even the room itself could weaken, which worried Riella about the Moonstone Room's safety. Meanwhile, Haun explained that if the room weakened, several stones could potentially get out of control at once, which would endanger the entire kingdom. He continued to reason that it was unlikely that Duchess Hosang would want all her precious stones to remain forever locked away in that room. The guy mentioned that, in some ways, he agreed with Riella, and also believed it was better not to disturb the Duchess's memory, so that more of her legacy could be preserved. However, the stones in the room, if used correctly, could greatly benefit the people around them, and therefore should not be allowed to fade into oblivion. At this point, the discussion about the stones was put on hold, and the lawyer reminded Dirt, in order to move to the mansion, the Archduke would need to gather his things from his estate. Hound was surprised that he had to pick up something, so the man clarified that the Archduke would have to work with documents at Riella's mansion. The Archduke was not entirely satisfied with the current situation, but he had nowhere else to go. He genuinely wanted to stay in Riella's mansion. Riella, just as much as Hound, was uncomfortable with the arrangement. The lawyers made it seem as though they should live together, not just help each other. Han had received everything in this manner, and was now confused, as he had initially intended to simply defend the new mistress in the Room of Stones. A little later, the Archduke's personal assistant brought all the necessary items, and they stood on the street discussing where to put everything. Riella watched from the window of her room, surprised. Until recently, she hadn't believed the Archduke would really move into her mansion. She confided in her assistant that she was worried about his move, as she had no idea how to communicate with him. Nia immediately began to console the mistress, while also helping her prepare, advising her on how to ignore Hound. As Riella walked around the mansion, she saw Hound, along with the lawyers, sorting out business matters and handling everything with ease. She stopped outside the door, surprised by how easily the Archduke could fit into the life of the mansion. Riella realized that her first impression of him was wrong. He was very different from the persona he tried to project. While she stood near the door, a man's voice suddenly called out her name, indicating that he knew her. She turned around to see the Archduke's assistant, who introduced himself as Pooh. He explained that he would be staying at the mansion while Hound was there. Riella felt overwhelmed by the unfamiliar man's energy as he continued talking about letters arriving for the Archduke. He quickly excused himself, leaving the girl in shock at his talkativeness. Before leaving, Pooh handed Riella a letter. She thought about how different he was from Hound, then opened the envelope. What she read inside the letter frightened her so much that all other thoughts vanished, replaced only by concern over the contents. Riella immediately ran to find her assistant, knowing only Nia could help her address the new problem described in the letter. Later, the Archduke finished his work for the day, bid the lawyers goodbye, and dismissed them until the next morning. He glanced around and, visibly displeased, asked why Riella had not come to the meeting as promised, especially since lunch had already passed. Pooh, standing nearby, recalled that the maid had reported that Riella, along with Nia, had urgently left the mansion, which was why she hadn't made it to the meeting. Hound immediately grew angry, declaring that such behavior was far too dangerous and that he should have been informed so he could accompany the girls. However, looking at the angry Archduke, the lawyers thought that he, in fact, was the most dangerous person in the kingdom. Meanwhile, in great haste, the coachman drove the horses as Nia and Riella were riding in his carriage. They were in a rush, but thanks to the coachman, the girls made it on time. Still, Riella continued to worry, reproaching herself for almost forgetting about such an important matter. Nia, who had also read the letter given to Pooh, wasn't as frightened and tried to console her mistress, suggesting that the letter could have been much worse. However, Riella remained anxious as the letter informed her that her flower shop had been closed for a long time, and if it continued, she would be disqualified from the flower competition. Nia, in a lighter mood, reminded Riella that it had been a while since they visited the village, and Riella could finally see her friends, the villagers she knew so well, and who knew her just as much. Riella became serious and asked her assistant to carry out their agreed-upon plan. Nia was thrilled to take on the task and promised to perform it to the best of her ability. As they drove through the village, all the residents turned to look at them with interest, as they had never seen such a carriage in these parts. After circling the area to find the best place to stop, the coachman took the girls to a flower shop. As Nia and Riella got out of the carriage, local boys nearby immediately recognized Riella and began spreading the news that she had arrived in the village. Rumours spread quickly, and before Riella could even enter her store, she was surrounded by a crowd of acquaintances, all asking different questions. Most of the chatter focused on the fact that Riella had received a rich inheritance, which meant she was living very well, but continued to lead her usual life. Riella, to some extent, was prepared for such rumours, but it still bothered her that the villagers would inflate any information and discuss it for a long time. Initially, she had been careless, tending to the mansion's greenhouse, when she suddenly discovered that the morning newspaper was nowhere to be found. Riella had been eager to read the news about the village and the surrounding area, so she searched the mansion for her assistant to inquire about the missing paper. When she finally found Nia, she learned that Nia had deliberately withheld the newspaper to keep her from becoming upset, but Riella insisted on reading it. To her surprise, she found a host of rumours about herself in the newspaper, most of which were completely untrue. Astonished, she turned to Nia and asked if everyone in the village seriously thought such things. Nia didn't have an answer that would reassure her mistress. Riella thought that if she had even the smallest part in spreading these rumours, she wouldn't be as upset as she was now. After a moment's thought, Nia came up with a brilliant idea. They could invite a restaurant to the mansion, so Riella could release her frustration by enjoying some delicious food. At first, Riella thought Nia was joking, but later she was surprised to find tables set with gourmet food that hadn't been prepared in the mansion. Nia explained that she had personally invited the chef from the restaurant to prepare the most delicious dishes. Riella thanked Nia and admitted she was happy, though she wasn't sure she could accept all the food and spend money on it. Nia insisted that it didn't matter where the inheritance money went as long as it was spent on the mistress. With permission from the lawyers, Nia could get Riella anything she wanted. Looking at the spread before her, Riella dreamily said that she wanted simple and tasty ice cream. Nia immediately gave orders for the cooks to bring out the most delicious ice cream in various sizes and colours. Riella was overjoyed at the variety and warmly thanked Nia for the treat. Even now, she recalled with gratitude how delicious it had been, though now it felt a bit out of place with the constant presence of her acquaintances, who were relentlessly asking about everything happening in the mansion and the lands she had inherited. Riella gathered her courage and asked the people around her to step aside so she could go to her flower shop. She stopped in front of the store and examined it closely, trying to figure out where to start. The first thing she decided to do was clear the dust from the sign in front of the store, much to the surprise of the residents watching her. Then she opened the door and began to tidy up the flowers. A resident asked why she was bothering with such menial tasks given her inheritance. Riella, with a stony expression, replied that she was preparing for the reopening, surprising her friends, who thought she no longer needed to work. Nia, coming to Riella's aid, declared that she wouldn't let anyone criticize her mistress and advised that she shouldn't just throw away the Duchess's money. Remembering the plan they had discussed, Riella approached her friend Robbins and asked for his help. He agreed, and Riella whispered to him, explaining her fear of the scary and strong maid who accompanied her everywhere. She handed Robbins a box and asked him to help carry it. She also shared a secret, telling him she wasn't really an heiress, but merely a person assigned to that role. She asked him not to tell anyone, though she knew that soon enough the entire village would find out through Robbins, which was what she wanted. Nia, impressed with Robin's talkativeness, believed their plan had worked, and the mistress would be left alone with the rumours. Riella, though, wasn't sure, but she hoped it would work. The very next day, Riella saw that the plan had succeeded when she went to buy apples from an old woman she knew. The woman, upon seeing Riella, offered to sell the apples for a cheaper price, feeling sorry for her. As Riella walked through the village, she heard whispered conversations behind her, as everyone now knew the story Riella had told Robbins. Returning to her store, Riella told Nia that their plan had worked, and life would now be a little calmer. Nia asked if the lady was hungry, to which Riella replied she wanted to make apple sandwiches for both of them. Nia was surprised because she thought she was supposed to cook, but Riella explained that Nia was a guest, so she would not cook. As Riella washed the apples, she thought about how, the next day, it would be harder to leave the mansion, but she still needed to get to the flower market. She regretted that she had to carry an assistant with her everywhere, but realized she couldn't walk alone without a bodyguard. She would need to find another one. While making the sandwiches, Riella thought about how the preparations for the flower competition would keep her busy, and how she would need to balance that with her mansion duties. After finishing the food, she realized something was missing from the sandwiches, and ran outside to get the last ingredient. She was confident everything would be fine, but then remembered the edible flowers she had planted in the backyard. She hoped they hadn't wilted, and rushed to gather them. As Riella stepped outside, she realized she hadn't asked Nia what flowers she liked. She was about to enter the garden when she accidentally stepped on a bottle and lost her balance. Expecting to fall, she was surprised when an unfamiliar, tall man easily caught her. He was very handsome, unlike anyone she had ever met, and she became very embarrassed. He smiled sweetly and she quickly moved away, thanking him warmly. He assured her he was fine and introduced himself as Lucien Morris. Before Riella could respond, Lucien knelt and proposed marriage to her. Stunned, she couldn't speak and simply stood there, stuttering. At that moment, Nia came looking for Riella, having been gone for a while. She was just as surprised to see Lucien, as they knew each other well. Lucien waved at Nia, still smiling, but Riella, still in shock, couldn't process his words. Meanwhile, Nia scolded Lucien, saying that if he wanted to see Riella, he, like everyone else, should have informed her first. The girl finally regained her composure and asked who Lucien was. He introduced himself as the chairman of the 26th Round Table Conference. Riella remembered Duchess Hoson mentioning people from the Round Table and expressing dissatisfaction with their activities. The Round Table was the largest association of stonemancers in Cardia, providing donations and warriors to fight the dragons. Lucien, being from this community, apologized for his sudden proposal and explained there were reasons for it. He asked for permission to explain everything in a more comfortable setting, away from the street. Nia persuaded Riella to listen to him, so the three of them moved to a nearby café. Lucien invited them in and ordered drinks. The group enjoyed their coffee in silence at first. Riella observed Lucien with some concern, unsure of what to expect from him, but with Nia beside her, she felt somewhat reassured. Nia, on the other hand, was delighted by the free coffee, knowing her friend would not harm anyone. Eventually, Riella couldn't hold back and asked why a man she was meeting for the first time would suddenly propose to her. Lucien explained that the proposal was a decision made by the Round Table, and as chairman, he had no right to oppose it. He added that he had information about Duchess Hoson, which immediately piqued Riella's interest. Lucien continued, explaining that in the past, Duchess Hoson had supplied the Round Table with the necessary magical stones that allowed stonemancers to protect Cardia from dragons. However, a few months ago, the Round Table received a request for all the stones to be returned. The council complied, expecting them back after a standard check, but shortly after, news came of Duchess Hosang's death. The stones were never returned, causing chaos. The Round Table now desperately needed to replenish the lost crystals, but no one knew where to find them. The stonemancers were working tirelessly, even entering agreements in other countries, many of which were being terminated within Cardia. To resolve the situation, the Round Table decided they must retrieve Duchess Hosang's stones. One of the stonemancers, an older man, proposed marriage to Riella, but Lucien, not wanting to burden the girl with such a proposal, took it upon himself to represent the Round Table's interests. Riella was puzzled, asking why they couldn't simply contact her and borrow the stones. Lucien explained that marriage was the simplest way to transfer rights to precious stones among stonemancers. He added that such marriage proposals were common and seen as a formal greeting within the community, which they took in stride. Despite Lucien's explanation, Riella couldn't calm her unease about the situation. She told him directly that she would not accept the proposal. Lucien, regretfully, warned that if she rejected him, someone else would surely come forward, and it would be better for her to choose him over the others, who might be even more eager for the Duchess's stones, which now belonged to Riella. Although Riella was frightened by the thought of such suitors, she remained firm in her decision to not marry for such a reason. She wasn't a stonemancer after all. Lucien understood and tried to help, suggesting that if he were to show his feelings towards her, there might be fewer suitors. With that, he raised his voice and loudly proclaimed that Riella was refusing him. Passers-by immediately took notice. Lucien, eager for attention, continued his speech, hoping to draw more eyes to the situation. Riella listened in disbelief, praying that he wouldn't escalate things further. Just then, a figure appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, clearly angry. It was the Archduke, who immediately recognized Lucien and demanded an explanation for his public proposal to Riella. The crowd, sensing the potential for a major altercation, quickly turned their attention elsewhere, pretending they hadn't witnessed anything. Meanwhile, the Archduke, with a hint of sarcasm, suggested that rather than marrying Lucien, it would be better for Riella to marry him. Before the conversation could escalate further, Nia interrupted, intentionally coughing loudly to end the pointless argument about the mistress's marriage. In an attempt to avoid further tension, Nia dramatically fell to the floor and pretended to be ill. It wasn't until they returned to the estate that Nia claimed to feel better, though Riella remained deeply concerned. Meanwhile, the Archduke sat alone in his room at Riella's mansion, reflecting on the events that transpired at the café. He was mortified that he had actually fought for Riella's attention, even going so far as to propose marriage. Though he tried to console himself with the excuse that Lucien's persistence left him with no choice, it didn't make him feel any better. He still couldn't figure out what answer he was hoping for from Riella, and was uneasy about the possibility of a rejection. Suddenly, the Archduke noticed someone standing behind the door. Thanks to his skills as a stonemancer, he detected the intruder's presence before they revealed themselves. Concerned, he grabbed a weapon, preparing for any potential threat, and approached the door cautiously. Before he could make any defensive moves, the door opened, and Riella cautiously stepped in, apologizing for the late visit. She hoped she hadn't disturbed him. The Archduke assured her that he hadn't been asleep, and asked what had brought her to his room. Riella hesitated, clearly uncertain about how to express herself. She took a deep breath, clenched her fists in determination, and finally spoke. With great effort, she mustered the courage to ask if he would accompany her to the flower market the next day. The Archduke was confused by her request, unsure why she would need his company, as she could easily go to the market on her own. Riella explained that her lawyers had forbidden her to leave the mansion unaccompanied. Nia, initially agreeing to go with her, had fallen seriously ill, forcing Riella to seek someone else's assistance. Riella had been worried about Nia's condition, but Nia refused to see a doctor, claiming she would go in the morning. Seeing no other choice, Riella explained her situation and pleaded with the Archduke to go with her. Her pleading expression was enough to sway him, and he reluctantly agreed to accompany her the next day. The following day, they found themselves in the same carriage, heading to the city. At first, neither of them spoke, both unsure how to begin the conversation. Eventually, the Archduke broke the silence, asking if everything was all right with Riella, as she seemed unusually quiet. She explained that she was simply worried about Nia, who was still in her room. Despite the doctor's visit, Riella couldn't help but feel torn between her concern for her assistant and the pressure of potentially being disqualified from the festival. The Archduke, unfamiliar with the details of Riella's qualifications for the festival, asked her to explain. She shared that her status as a store owner required her to maintain a certain standing, and this was the first time she had been lucky enough to draw a spot. If she missed the opportunity, it might be her last chance. Riella promised that upon their return, she would find another strong stonemancer to replace Nia. At the mention of Lucien's possible involvement, the Archduke's lip twitched with visible displeasure. He quickly interrupted her, insisting there was no need to find anyone else to take his place, as he would continue to accompany her wherever she needed to go. Upon arrival at the flower festival, Riella's excitement was palpable. She hadn't been to such an event in a long time, and the vibrant array of plants and bustling crowd lifted her spirits. As she pulled the Archduke along, her hand firmly gripping his sleeve, the Archduke found himself unexpectedly blushing. It was strange to him that Riella was so comfortable pulling him around like this. The Archduke asked if the market was always this busy, and Riella explained that it was a special day, the one when all the rare flowers were brought in, which caused the usual long lines. Eager to see the auction, she grabbed his hand once again and led him through the crowd. After struggling through the throng of people, they finally reached the flower auction. Riella, still catching her breath, asked if the Archduke was okay, to which he admitted it was probably harder on her than on him. Riella, however, assured him that she was fine and already had a list of flowers to buy. She began by looking for roses and carnations, then searched for gloriosus frus and lanthus. As Riella focused on finding the best flowers, the Archduke couldn't help but admire her dedication and attention to detail. Unexpectedly, he realized that Riella had been holding his hand for a while. The thought of holding her hand, initiating the gesture himself, crossed his mind, but he quickly dismissed it. He was unsure how she would react. As they made their purchases, Riella seemed pleased with the flowers she had selected. When the Archduke asked if they could go home, Riella agreed, although had she been on her own before receiving her inheritance, she would have continued to wander the market. At that moment, the Archduke noticed a group of people in red hats surrounded by a crowd, selling something. Curious, he asked Riella about them, and she explained that they were auctioning rare flowers. She was particularly interested in a flower called the elf, a rare and bright red variety that hadn't been seen for a long time. The crowd, eager to see it, rushed towards the auction. The Archduke, puzzled by the excitement, asked if the flower was really that special. Riella's eyes sparkled with excitement as she explained that the elf flower had been scarce, and its rarity made it highly coveted. The Archduke then asked if she intended to go see it, but Riella declined, not wanting to keep him waiting. With a soft smile, the Archduke turned and joined the crowd, drawn by the curiosity of the rare flower. Meanwhile, the woman in the headdress announced that they had 3 blossoming flowers and 2 buds up for bidding, starting the price at 5,000. She smiled sarcastically as she set the starting price, which was ridiculously high for an ordinary flower. Riella was shocked by such a price, as she never imagined that even rare plants could be so expensive. The people around them whispered in surprise, remembering that the starting price last time was only 300, not 5,000, which made things much more difficult for potential buyers. Though most of the people had come just to observe, there were also real buyers, and one of them immediately quoted 10,000 for the flowers. This caused a stir among the onlookers, who turned to see the first buyer. A red-haired, smug-looking man named Hayden appeared before them. He was the owner of the largest flower shop in the capital. Riella immediately recognized him, as she had often seen him purchasing flowers for large sums at auctions, even studying his flower arrangements. Hay had never seen him before, so he turned to the drooping Riella and asked her to tell him about Hayden so he could form his own opinion. The girl explained that Hayden had an apparent obsession with red flowers, as he seemed to buy everything of that variety. He was known for taking home flowers that others would never see again, making his reputation quite unpopular. Last year he had also purchased the rare elves, but these flowers were usually bought for exhibition halls and were never shown to the public. Riella, knowing that these elves could be the last of their kind, tried to calculate how much money she had left, but then she heard the price for the 5 flowers was, once again, set at 10,000 of their local currency, which could easily be equivalent to 500,000 in other countries. This made it even harder to bid. At that moment, a girl in the crowd named Milonia suddenly offered 10,000, 500 roos, forcing the saleswoman to return the flowers to their place. The crowd immediately recognized Milonia as someone who hadn't been seen in a long time, which sparked curiosity and surprise. Milonia lashed out at one man who had criticized her flower-growing style, arguing that it was unique to her. He retorted that it still looked creepy. Then Milonia's eyes locked with Hayden's, and the tension was palpable as a serious bidding war was about to begin. Indeed, the two began to raise the price higher and higher. In the end, Milonia could no longer stand it and demanded that Hayden give up, arguing that his business was slowly dying out and he needed money. Hayden, however, wasn't about to back down. He countered that it was Milonia who should stop, since even her followers had already turned their backs on her. Unable to reach a compromise, the two continued to escalate the price while the onlookers watched in silence. Riella, feeling exhausted by the situation, tugged on the Archduke's sleeve, drawing attention to herself. When he turned around, she suggested that they had seen enough and should return to the carriage and head back to the mansion. H was surprised that Riella wasn't interested in purchasing the flowers or staying to watch the verbal battle between Hayden and Milonia. In truth, the girl wanted the flowers, but she didn't have enough money. Rather than continue torturing herself, she wanted to leave. Just then, the woman in the red headdress called out that the final price was 20,000, and if no one else bid, the flowers would be sold. But, unexpectedly, Han, standing behind the crowd, loudly declared that he was offering 100,000 for the flowers. The crowd gasped in shock. Riella was so stunned by what she had heard that she couldn't speak. She simply stood there, watching the Archduke and the rare elf seller in disbelief. She had never imagined that such a large sum would be bid, and she asked, almost in disbelief, if she had truly heard him correctly. Han repeated his bid with an air of arrogance and irritation, brazenly challenging anyone who could raise it. Riella was even more horrified by this display. Milonia, who had never seen Han before, was shocked that someone would offer such an amount for flowers. Hayden, in addition to his surprise, felt the sting of defeat, as he knew he could outbid Milonia. But he was no match for this unknown buyer. Meanwhile, the Archduke stood as calmly as possible in the middle of the street, waiting for the flowers to be wrapped. Gradually, people began to recognize him, and when it became clear that it was Hound who had bought the flowers, astonished exclamations rippled through the crowd. The noise was something the Archduke did not appreciate. Riella grabbed the Archduke's shoulder and, filled with excitement, demanded to speak with him to learn more about the flowers. The Archduke leaned in and, puzzled, asked if she wanted the flowers so badly. If so, what was the problem now? Riella explained that the flowers were beautiful, but 100,000 was too much to pay for them. She believed such large sums shouldn't be spent recklessly. Hound sighed calmly, thinking the lady might be after something more serious, then said he understood the value of money. He looked Riella in the eye and remarked that, for someone like her, you had to pay a price that matched her worth. When Riella grumbled in dissatisfaction, the Archduke reminded her that she was the Duchess of Hosan, a position that had already changed things for her. He added that as the only Archduke in the kingdom, he shouldn't lower himself. While they were bickering, the bright red elves were sold to Hound for 100,000, as no one else had bid higher. The crowd was thrilled to witness such an expensive transaction, while both Hayden and Milonia were disappointed they had missed out on the plants. Anne immediately turned and demanded the flowers from the saleswoman. Although the rules stated they should only be handed over after payment, the woman made an exception. When the flowers were presented to the Archduke, he turned to Riella and handed them to her, saying that he had bought them for her. Riella blushed, incredibly grateful for the gift, though embarrassed by its price. Looking at her with the bright red flowers, Han became slightly embarrassed and remarked that the elves suited her well. Later, as they were returning to the mansion together, Riella sat in the carriage, shaking. She had accepted the flowers, and now the deal for the lot couldn't be cancelled. Then, she remembered something important and called out to the Archduke, saying she had almost forgotten it. He asked curiously what she meant, and Riella, beaming, said she was talking about breakfast. A little later, Riella brought the Archduke to her close friend, Rena, who was overjoyed to see both of them. Rena immediately sized up the unfamiliar man from head to toe before asking Riella who he was. Riella decided to be honest and confessed that she had brought the Archduke himself to eat with her. Unexpectedly, Riella began to fuss as though deciding what to do. Then she elegantly curtsied and introduced herself to Han, welcoming him to her establishment. The Archduke accepted the bow calmly, but Riella could barely hold back her laughter, knowing full well that Riella had been rehearsing this moment for a long time. Afterward, Rena went to cook, and Riella realized that her friend would likely be proud of herself for quite some time. A few minutes later, Rena served her restaurant's signature dish, which shimmered beautifully on the plate. Riella was delighted and assured Han that her friend's food was truly delicious. As the girl chatted on, the Archduke interrupted, shrewdly asking if Riella was planning to pay for the flowers with her breakfast. The lady immediately fell silent, embarrassed, because she was unhappy that he had figured it out, though she didn't admit anything. Secretly, Riella hoped the Archduke would like Riella's food. Han, however, was lost in thought. On the battlefield, he often had to quickly eat simple soup and crackers, rarely giving much thought to the taste of food. He hadn't savoured a meal in a long time, and watching Riella enjoy her meal, he was struck by the thought that all the struggles of his life had been worth it to see this peaceful moment. The only thing he couldn't accept was how Riella worried about money. He knew that such an amount was nothing to her. Watching her eat, he couldn't help but calculate that even if he took 1,000,000 rubles from Hosang's inheritance, no one would notice. With a smile, He wondered what Riella's reaction would be if he suddenly gave her flowers worth 1,000,000 rubles. Suddenly, Han was surprised by his own thoughts. He couldn't understand why he was even considering giving something to the girl. He concluded that he had become too relaxed due to the contrast between his peaceful life in the battlefield and his observations of Riella. Forcing himself to focus, he told himself that this food was no different from the soup on the battlefield, and he shouldn't let his emotions interfere. Meanwhile, as Han and Riella were having breakfast at Rina's, Nia's condition was worsening. The girl was gradually losing her human form, and her assistant couldn't understand why, since the power of the stone shouldn't have dried up. She had secretly eaten one of her mistress's shining flowers, but it hadn't helped. Nia experienced enormous pain, and, when she looked into the mirror, was afraid of her own reflection. Her assistant suggested it might be the work of Hound, but quickly realized that if he had been behind it, he would have eliminated her differently. Nia was terrified of the moment when the Heliodor stone would stop functioning properly, and her dragon instincts began to manifest. She had promised Duchess Hoson that she wouldn't waste this new life, which made her even more anxious. The assistant was determined to fulfill Hosang's last request, to protect Riella at all costs. However, Nia questioned whether she had been too greedy, wondering if she should have found another protector for Riella and returned to where Hosang had found her. Despite her worries, Nia cherished the time spent with Riella, because it was the only time she could laugh so freely. But now, the moment of danger had come, when she heard that Han had brought the lady to the palace, which was a very inconvenient timing for Nia. Meanwhile, the Archduke and Madame were lightly discussing the cost and variety of flowers as they approached the mansion. Nia, filled with fear, thought it was too late for her to run, as she wouldn't be able to slip out of the room unnoticed. The assistant was terrified that Riella might be frightened by her appearance, just like the person Nia had once encountered. She desperately didn't want her mistress to call her a monster or, even worse, accidentally harm Riella. Falling to her knees, Nia covered her ears with her hands, struggling to hold back her sobs. She was consumed by fear, not knowing who or what to pray to, but silently hoping that everything would stop and that she would return to normal. Suddenly, a voice in panic cut through her thoughts. The girl jumped up, searching the room, but found no one. However, the voice persisted, and, though she didn't truly believe it would help, Nia demanded that the unfamiliar voice return her to her original appearance. To her amazement, she felt herself completely revert to normal. Her human form had fully returned. Looking around the room in confusion, Nia couldn't spot anything unusual, and even her headache had vanished. As she tried to process what had just happened, she realized her memories were clouded, and she couldn't recall what had occurred. The more she tried to remember, the more she forgot. Just then, Riella timidly knocked on the door of Nia's room, afraid of disturbing her but eager to see her. The mistress asked for permission to enter, and Nia, relieved to have regained her appearance, allowed Riella inside. When Riella entered, concern was written on her face, despite Nia's assurance that she could handle things. Grabbing Nia's hand, Riella checked her temperature and pulse, only then believing that her assistant was truly back to normal. Riella explained that she had bought Nia a lot of fruits and flowers that were easy to digest and would help her feel better. Nia laughed cheerfully at the thought. When Nia was completely well, she and Riella went to her flower shop. There, the assistant quickly found herself in a playful battle for a glass of juice with Hound. The Archduke, however, declared that Nia had no right to drink or eat the same things as people of higher status. Riella, watching this exchange with concern, felt awkward. As they continued, a woman knocked on the shop window, asking for help. Riella immediately approached her friend and inquired about the situation. The woman explained that she wanted to decorate a table in her restaurant with flowers, but had limited funds. She requested something inexpensive yet beautiful. Riella, who ran her flower business surprisingly well, quickly formed a plan to fulfill the client's request. She carefully selected a few damaged and single flowers, knowing she could combine them into a stunning bouquet. She focused on flowers with slightly wilted petals or broken stems and, with her special scissors, cut the necessary pieces. Afterward, she combined 5 different types of flowers to create an affordable yet beautiful arrangement. When she handed the bouquet to the client, Riella explained that she had used slightly damaged flowers, which kept the price low. The woman was delighted and, before leaving, promised she would never buy from anyone else but Riella. Throughout this, the Archduke watched with slight dissatisfaction, particularly because Riella, with such an inheritance, was working in a flower shop. Nia noticed this and commented that Haud seemed to be eyeing Riella so intently that he might wear a hole in her with his gaze. The Archduke, embarrassed, turned away. He almost missed Lucien's entrance into the shop. Lucien, having gotten bored, decided to visit Riella. Concerned, he brought her a snack so she wouldn't go hungry while working. Riella was surprised by the gesture. Lucien pulled out sweets with flowers, a rare treat that she loved but could hardly find, as they were usually sold out quickly. Seeing this exchange, Haun's anger flared, unable to stand the close communication between Riella and the Round Table representative. Nia, teasing the Archduke, laughed and remarked that he looked as though he wanted to kill Lucien instead of treating him to food. They tried to avoid the Archduke's presence as Lucien stepped further into the store. Lucien greeted Nia and Hound warmly, but the Archduke responded with a cold greeting, still irked by Lucien's closeness to Riella, even though Lucien had no fault in it. Han called Lucien's position into question, suggesting that the representative of the Round Table must be busy. Lucien, however, replied that he had less to do than the Archduke in war, and that, of the two, it was Han who needed to leave the shop. Hearing this exchange, Riella was surprised to learn that the Archduke had also been offered the position of representative for the Round Table, but had refused it. After the argument settled, Lucien noticed the papers on the table and deduced that they were materials related to the Room of Stones. The Archduke, irritated, tried to dismiss the topic, but Lucien had already sat down and began to think aloud with the others about how to open the room. Reluctantly, the Archduke explained that he was able to guess which stones were in the room the last time the door had been opened. He was certain that his guesses were correct and that the Duchess had placed strong protections on the room, making it difficult to open. Shuddering at the thought of the old woman's troublesome nature, Han swallowed hard, knowing for sure that Hosang had designed these puzzles to make him suffer. He explained that the stone room consisted of 3 parts, meaning there would be 3 stages of defense. Lucien, puzzled, asked why they couldn't simply open the doors and take the stones, but Han explained that in order to obtain the strongest stones, they needed to open all the doors. There was no other way to take them. Meanwhile, even the very first and simplest door posed a difficult test, making a lot of noise as it was opened by Camilla, something Riella remembered all too well. Han continued explaining that in the first room there was the wind-free pilly, a very aggressive stone. Lucien, aware of its dangers, was concerned, but the Archduke reassured him, confidently stating that he could pacify the pilly. Lucien was partly convinced but still had doubts. Han then mentioned that other stones in the room would also pose challenges. Riella, who had been carefully taking notes, began to think back to the day when Camilla entered the room. The Archduke had been able to close the door before the other stones were triggered, but he had managed to glimpse a few. That was why Han was now so worried. He was sure that the obsidian of the abyss was inside, still dormant. Everyone, except Riella, who knew nothing of the stones, grew alarmed. The obsidian of the abyss was one of the strongest stones, and Lucien, though sceptical, agreed that all possibilities should be considered. Riella, noticing their concern, was confused. Lucien, seeing her puzzled expression, began to explain that the obsidian of the abyss was a stone that brought darkness. This stone was feared, as it could cover an entire city in darkness, and the radius of its effect was enormous. But interestingly, Lucien added, while everything around you may be completely black, if you looked up at the sky, you could still see stars. Nia confirmed Lucien's words, revealing that Duchess Hoson had once taught her to navigate by the stars so she could find her way in the dark. Riella was impressed by her assistant's skills, and the others, jealous of the praise, grumbled that they could do it too. Lucien continued to think aloud, realizing that inside the room of stones, no stars would be visible due to the ceiling. This made Riella uneasy, as it meant they wouldn't be able to navigate using the stars. Hound added to Riella's concerns, explaining that it was highly likely that the Duchess had placed the obsidian of the abyss alongside another powerful stone, the infinity spinel. Together, these stones would create a darkness so absolute that no one could find their way due to the infinite space created by the combination. Lucien expressed concern, stating that no matter how powerful a stonemancer was, they would be in danger if they entered the room. He scolded the Archduke for planning to go in alone, warning him that the stones were too unpredictable and ruthless. Nia, teasing Hound, pointed out that Duchess Hoson had conquered all of these stones on her own, which made Riella feel awkward. The Archduke, undeterred, was determined to open the room at all costs, and assured Lucien that he didn't need to come with him. The two men continued to argue when, suddenly, the door to the flower shop swung open and a young man rushed inside, calling for Riella. Alvin, as the boy was named, was immediately met with cold stares from Han, Hound, and Lucien, who considered him too noisy. Alvin, worried he had made a mistake by coming in, hesitated, but Riella, sensing his fear, quickly comforted him. Turning to the evil trio, she asked them to stop scaring her friend, as he had come with an important message. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted, and Han, Hound, and Lucien became noticeably warmer, allowing Alvin to speak freely. Alvin explained that he urgently needed the largest and most beautiful flowers, as time was running out. Riella, noticing his anxiety, asked if Charlotte had truly returned. Alvin confirmed that she would arrive in just a few minutes, but there were no flowers prepared. Riella felt sympathy for the couple, knowing they had never been able to confess their feelings during their past separation. She genuinely wanted to help Alvin. Alvin, desperate, offered to pay any amount if Riella could make a bouquet before Charlotte's arrival. Without hesitation, Riella set to work, gathering the most beautiful and largest flowers she could find. Her hands moved swiftly, expertly, alternating between tools to create the perfect bouquet. Alvin, watching nervously, saw a group of stonemancers returning from a battle against the dragon, and among them was Charlotte. He shouted the news to Riella, and she rushed to speed up her work. With mere seconds left, Riella had to decide which flowers would best suit Charlotte's appearance, considering her hair and eyes. Throughout the frantic preparations, the Archduke, observing the scene, realized that he had never considered flowers to be of much interest before, but now he found himself fascinated by their compositions. Han, though he knew Riella could use some assistance, was at a loss for what to do since he knew nothing about flowers and decided to remain out of the way. Meanwhile, Lucien rolled up his sleeves and approached the lady, asking if he could help her with anything. The girl thanked him for the offer, but explained that if he had no experience in assembling a bouquet, he wouldn't be able to help. Lucien then took the already prepared flowers and, in just a few moments, crafted a beautiful bouquet. Riella was delighted, especially since he'd managed to correctly arrange the flowers and materials in the composition. Now that Lucien's skills had been confirmed, he took on the red flowers and asked the girl to handle the purple ones. As Riella and Lucien worked together, cheerfully chatting, Naya and Han felt out of place, as they didn't quite fit into the situation. But before long, the bouquet was ready and handed to Alvin. Upon seeing its beauty, Alvin was overjoyed. He immediately rushed to Charlotte and happily handed her the bouquet, which she loved so much that she even burst into tears. Riella watched the happy reunion of the two lovers, feeling pleased that both of them were so happy with her bouquet. Suddenly she remembered her assistant, turned to Lucien and asked where he had learned to handle flowers. Lucien simply replied that his father was the royal florist, Sir Mice, and that he had learned a little about flowers from him. Hearing this, Riella initially thought Lucien might be mistaken. After all, Sir Mose had come from humble beginnings and had risen to become a respected florist for the royal family. He was renowned for breeding new and rare plant varieties. Riella could hardly believe Lucien was the son of such a great florist. Still, she felt a sense of gratitude that she now had a friend who was so knowledgeable about flowers. She came closer to Lucien and began begging him to ask his father a few questions about flowers. He agreed. Watching their sweet exchange, Han felt a pang of sadness and disappointment. He understood that he had no right to limit Riella's interactions, but somehow the idea of her being closer to someone else than to him bothered him. Even though he had a duty to open the room of stones and retrieve all the stones there, something about Riella's connection with Lucien stirred feelings in him that he couldn't quite understand. Just then, a crowd of assistants from the king's palace burst into the shop without knocking. One of the men, who seemed to command the guards, stepped forward, bowed to the Archduke and delivered a message from the palace. Han gave his permission to speak, and the guards explained that the king demanded his immediate return, along with all the stones. Riella was surprised by the urgency of the message and the quick return of the guards. The Archduke silently walked past her, remarking that since he had been called, he must go. Riella called out to him, wanting to talk, but before she could catch up, he had already jumped into his carriage and left. She felt a wave of concern, wondering what might be happening, but Nia calmed her down, explaining that, as the strongest stonemancer, Han was frequently called on urgent missions. Riella tried to distract herself from her worries by taking care of her greenhouse and shop. However, she couldn't help but think about the Archduke. Nia had told her his absence wouldn't last long, but it had already been 3 days with no word from him. She was upset because he hadn't even sent a letter or had someone deliver a message. Later, during dinner, Riella couldn't help but stare at the empty seat across from her, where the Archduke's plate remained untouched. Nia noticed her thoughts and gently suggested that she not blame him, but Riella couldn't shake the feeling of disappointment. The following day, Riella went to check the mail. Her heart raced, hoping to find something from Han, but after searching through every letter, she found nothing. She returned to her room, feeling a mix of sadness and frustration. As the rain poured outside, she watched the flowers in her chambers, but couldn't seem to find joy. That night, unable to sleep from the uncertainty, Riella decided to sneak into Han's room to feel closer to him. She was surprised by how empty and cold the room felt, even though it had only been a week since he had left. Still, not wanting to leave, she lay down on the bed and thought about their time together. She realized that without those wonderful moments, it might be easier to cope with his absence. Before she knew it, she had fallen asleep. The next morning, Nia came searching for her, and Riella woke up embarrassed to have fallen asleep in someone else's room. To her surprise, Nia announced that Han had returned. Overwhelmed with happiness, Riella quickly got ready and rushed toward the mansion. Unsure of what to say, she silently looked at the Archduke. Han, noticing her sweet expression, was slightly embarrassed but greeted her warmly. Riella, having chosen a cool demeanour, turned her head away slightly and greeted him more formally in response. Seeing the coldness in her behaviour, Han looked puzzled, not understanding why she was acting this way. His confused expression irritated Riella, as she believed it was wrong of him to leave without telling her anything. So she continued to coldly ask how he had been, and scolded him for being gone for an entire week. However, Riella suddenly became embarrassed, unsure whether her tone had been too formal. Han asked why she had been waiting for him and worrying, since, in his view, they weren't particularly close. Taken off guard by the question, Riella didn't know how to respond. Han, blushing a little, continued to ask why she had been waiting for him, expressing curiosity about her feelings. Realizing she couldn't avoid the question, Riella admitted that she had been worried all this time. She tried to justify herself by saying it was normal to worry about someone when you hadn't heard from them in a while. Hearing this, Han felt a warmth inside from her words. He didn't say anything, but was moved by her concern. Riella, feeling even more embarrassed, blushed from the excitement that overcame her. She added that although he was strong, monsters could still hurt him, but Han, still quiet, leaned in closer and stared directly into her eyes, as if confirming whether she was telling the truth. After a pause, he admitted that he had been embarrassed to talk about his investigation, but assured her there were no enemies nearby. However, seeing how worried she was, Han realized she wanted him to be more attentive to her. Remembering this, he decided to change the subject and asked if she had time over the weekend. Riella immediately replied that she didn't, explaining that she would be busy with lawyers. Han was surprised at how seriously she took her duties, and Riella simply smiled in response. The weekend brought some serious news. Riella was told she needed to inspect her property. She was surprised, but the lawyer explained that it would be useful to know the full extent of her inheritance. He suggested she examine the nearby area, which had a few houses. Since the lawyer had a lot to do, he invited Riella to join Han on a trip. Riella felt that there would be no problems travelling with the Archduke and her assistant, as they had learned to avoid quarrels. That same night, a heavy downpour made her worry that the trip would be cancelled. But the next morning the sun shone brightly, and all the puddles had dried up, so they could safely depart. Riella was eager for the trip, but was worried that the carriage ride would cause motion sickness for Nia and Han. She was thrilled about the journey, but when she handed Nia the bag for the trip, she asked Han why Nia wasn't coming with them. The Archduke explained that since the trip had been spontaneous, they didn't have time to get Nia's permission. This, however, did not stop Nia from threatening Han, ensuring he would closely monitor the mistress's safety. And so, Riella and the Archduke set off on their journey together. Soon a hole appeared in their path, requiring a jump. Riella wasn't at all startled. Instead, she grabbed the reins, spurred her horse, and expertly leapt over the obstacle. When she landed gracefully, the Archduke was stunned and asked, "Where did you learn to ride like that?" Riella explained that, as a child, she often rode with one of her sisters before they moved to the capital. She added that she had two older sisters, one who breeds horses and the other who works as a doctor. Hound asked if she missed them and how she coped when she couldn't see them. Riella admitted that she missed them, but there wasn't much she could do since her sisters were busy with their work. Most of the time, she tried not to dwell on the separation and focused on her own affairs. Seeing how difficult it was for Riella to talk about her family, Hound suggested changing the subject and taking a break. The lady, somewhat tired from the trip, agreed. She quickly dismounted and noticed something sparkling on the ground nearby. Intrigued, she stepped closer and discovered a small crystal lying on a stone, shining in the sunlight. Hound confirmed her suspicion. "That's a crystal," he said. Riella asked if it had any special powers. The Archduke asked her to hand it over, and with a casual gesture, he activated it. Suddenly, a whole flock of sheep appeared from the crystal's memory, much to Riella's delight. When she asked why she was so surprised by something so simple, Hound explained that Duchess Hoson had never shown her anything like this before. Eager to see more, Riella asked if he could show her something else. The Archduke agreed and set off in search of another stone. Soon he found another crystal, which, although menacing in appearance, he decided to activate. This time, the surroundings were enveloped in complete darkness, leaving only the two of them in sight. A moment later, two faint lights appeared, flickering softly, gradually illuminating the area. Riella, though initially surprised, wasn't afraid. Hound speculated that they were facing one of the strongest stones, with memories dating back to the creation of the world. He explained that the strength of a stone wasn't just about its innate qualities, but also how it was cared for. To clarify, he pulled out two sapphires, one polished and one raw. He first demonstrated the power of a finely crafted sapphire by conjuring a small flame. The blue light fascinated Riella, resembling a real, blazing blue flame. After she had seen enough, Hound activated the raw sapphire. A massive blue fire engulfed them. its roar stretching for meters. Startled, Riella instinctively grabbed Haun's clothes for comfort. He too was caught off guard, embarrassed by the sudden closeness. He'd signed a document barring him from initiating any physical contact with her, but since she had touched him first, he realized he hadn't broken his oath. Riella, still frightened, asked Haun to cancel the effect. He did so and explained that the first sapphire had been passed down through generations without much care, while the second had been cherished by its owner, preserving its original appearance. As Haun spoke, Riella began thinking about Duchess Hosang's many powerful stones that had been neglected over time. The Archduke then shifted the conversation, telling her that the royal family was eager to claim Hosang's inheritance and that she might soon receive many business and marriage proposals. At this, Riella immediately thought of Lucien. Haun noted that if she married him, she would have control over the inheritance, as only their children would be able to claim it. Riella felt a deep sadness, realizing that both she and Haun were trapped in the expectations of others. The Archduke concluded that the royal family's greed for the inheritance would help weaken the influence of the other powerful noble houses. Grateful for the explanation, Riella reflected on the enormity of what she had inherited, which only filled a few lines in the will. Suddenly they heard barking. Turning around, Riella saw a farmer running across the field, shouting at his dog, who was happily playing and not at all inclined to return. The sight of the dog's carefree joy brought a smile to Riella's face, distracting her from the heavy thoughts that had been weighing on her. Meanwhile, the owner became increasingly upset as his dog continued to escape. Desperate to retrieve the lively fugitive, the dog eventually ran straight up to Riella, sniffing her harmlessly and wagging its tail. The farmer quickly apologized for his pet's behavior, but the lady didn't mind and even petted the dog. She asked, "Is his name really Hound?" The owner chuckled and acknowledged that naming the dog after the Archduke might be a bit much, but his daughter had insisted, as the Archduke had once saved her. As the farmer finally caught the dog and began to pet him, he told Riella an old story. The farmer had once lived on the northern front line, and one day a dragon attacked his village, setting everything ablaze. He tried to escape with his family, but his youngest daughter went missing. Desperate, he searched for her amidst the fire until a sudden downpour extinguished the flames, allowing him to search more easily. It was thanks to this rain that the farmer heard his daughter's voice and found her. Supia had been trapped in a barn which had caught fire and couldn't leave earlier. She had saved a puppy from the flames, which was why she hadn't joined the others when they fled. Though scared, she was unharmed, and her father hugged her, relieved but also scolding her for running off. Supia then mentioned that an uncle had saved her, someone named Han, and it was his reign that had helped everyone. The farmer, still grateful but never having been able to meet the Archduke to thank him, added that despite the rumours about Han, he remained a benefactor to his family. Riella looked at Han, now understanding the connection between the dog and the man, though Han remained silent, not wanting to reveal himself. She too said nothing. The farmer then asked what the unfamiliar pair was doing in the area, wondering if they were employees of Lady Riella. Riella blushed slightly at the respectful way he addressed her and asked, "What do you mean?" The farmer explained that he was referring to the heirs of Duchess Hosang and expressed his concerns about what would happen after her death. However, he was glad that Riella had inherited everything, as it meant he could continue working freely in agriculture. Riella didn't know how to answer, but was relieved when the Archduke stepped in, explaining that they were simply preparing for the hunting season. The farmer accepted this and apologized for holding them up before heading off. As they resumed their journey, Riella asked why Han hadn't told the farmer the truth. The Archduke replied that revealing their identities would have been burdensome, and they didn't fully know who the farmer was. Riella countered that she wasn't in any real danger, and the lawyers had assured her that no one would benefit if something happened to her. Han remained silent for a moment, then explained that there were people who acted out of hatred, not for profit, and their actions could be unpredictable. Riella, taken aback, had no response. She felt as if Han had faced these dangers many times before, which is why he spoke so confidently. Han reassured her that everything was fine today, and when Riella asked what he meant, he revealed that he had scanned the farmer with a jasper scout stone, a crystal designed for reconnaissance. It had scanned the entire area, even the dog, and found nothing suspicious. Riella was intrigued, asking how Han had acquired such a useful stone. Han explained that his older brother had given it to him, but his mood shifted slightly as he spoke of it. Riella realized that he was referring to the king, and her smile faded. Han asked her not to tell anyone that he possessed the jasper stone, as it was traditionally a royal possession, meant to protect the king from enemies. Riella shuddered, asking if it was normal for the Archduke to share such important information with her. Han explained that now the situation was fair, since he knew her secret and she knew his. Lost in thought, Han remembered the moment his brother had given him the jasper stone. Initially, Han had tried to refuse it, but the king insisted, threatening to forbid him from participating in expeditions if he didn't accept it. The king had apologized, saying he wished he could give Han more but had to send him into battle. Han was so lost in thought that he didn't notice Riella calling his name. She then asked about the stone Han had used to summon rain during the dragon fight. Han explained that it was the Hauen shower stone, and Riella immediately noted that its name was similar to his own. Han agreed, saying it was like fate, and took out the stone for her to examine. Riella was curious and asked if the stone had always been this colour. Han explained that it had lost its power over time and was now in a state of hibernation. Suddenly, Riella had an idea. She rummaged through her pockets and found a petal from a glowing flower she had grown herself, a powerful and rare flower. She handed the petal to Han and asked if it might have a similar effect to the flower itself. Han was taken aback, not expecting Riella to offer part of the flower. She explained that she had found the petal that morning and picked it up with no harm intended. Riella believed it would be better to restore such an important stone quickly, so she gave the glowing petal to Han. The Archduke was still pleasantly embarrassed by the girl's help, as he highly valued glowing flowers, but he obeyed. After placing the petal on the stone, Han began to recite the required spell, not expecting a quick effect. However, surprisingly, the crystal almost immediately filled with bright colour, as if it were completely new and just purchased. Han was shocked that just one petal from a glowing flower could restore the stone's power so effectively. As he was about to thank the girl, thunder roared and an incredibly heavy downpour began the moment the stone activated. The Archduke stared at the girl in complete amazement, as he had not expected the stone to work so quickly. He remembered that this crystal had not responded well to him before, but he never imagined it would act like this. Apologizing to the lady for being unable to calm the crystal at that moment, Han told her to follow him. The rain was so cold that the girl could soon catch a chill, so the Archduke hurried to find shelter. Being familiar with the area, he quickly found a mansion, even through the heavy downpour. Riella tried to knock on the doors, but no one opened. Not daring to enter without permission, she hesitated. For some reason, Han stood silently, staring at the building for a moment before asking if the lady wanted to enter. Without waiting for an answer, he approached the door and tried to open it, peacefully at first. However, lacking the skills of a burglar and growing impatient, he simply broke the door down. Once inside, Han said calmly, "Since it's open, we can go in." The girl was worried about the violation, but the Archduke reasoned that she needed to warm up and change clothes, as she was already shivering. It was unclear what might happen next, so Riella agreed to stay. As they entered, she noted with surprise how dusty the house was, indicating the owners hadn't been there in a long time. Han went upstairs, saying he'd check the rest of the house, leaving Riella to inspect the first floor. Soon, Riella found an old blanket, which she intended to use as a towel, but she needed to shake the dust out of it first. Suddenly, a clean towel fell on her from behind, ideal for drying herself. Riella screamed in surprise, turning around to find the Archduke, who had decided to play a little joke on her. Han told her not to be offended and urged her to dry off quickly to avoid catching a cold. Since Han hadn't brought himself a towel, he removed his wet top and started wringing out the bottom of his clothes. Rielle, noticing he wasn't drying himself off, suggested he should too. Han replied that he was fine and, feeling fatigued, rubbed his head. The girl looked at him sarcastically and, taking advantage of the moment, came up with a playful plan to get back at him for the scare. While Han relaxed, Rielle threw a towel over his head, just like he had done for her. Unlike Rielle, Han wasn't frightened, but he was slightly annoyed by the surprise. However, by the time he looked up, she had already disappeared from the room. She shouted to him to make sure he dried himself off so he wouldn't freeze. Han, now left alone, obeyed and began drying himself, although he noticed a faint floral scent from the towel, which made him feel a little embarrassed. Meanwhile, Rielle, hiding in another room, worried that she might have overdone the prank, but it was too late to change anything now. Trying not to dwell on it, she remembered that she needed to change clothes. However, her clothes were so wet that they stuck to her, and it took quite a while to get them off. Han had already prepared a robe for her, and Rielle was grateful. After changing, she came back downstairs to thank him for his help, discovering that he had nearly gotten the fire going to warm up. Anne called her closer to dry her clothes by the fire so they would dry faster, and Rielle obediently placed her wet clothes near the fireplace. As the warmth enveloped her, she approached Han, smiling, and commented on how nice it was that the fireplace was so hot so they wouldn't be cold anymore. Han, embarrassed by the closeness, quickly stood up, turned away, and started searching for an excuse. Failing to come up with one, he muttered that he would check around the mansion and rushed into another room, leaving Rielle puzzled. Not chasing after him, Rielle stayed by the fire, warming herself. Her thoughts drifted to the glowing flowers, and she began to realize why the Duchess had asked her not to tell anyone about her abilities. They were very strong. However, she couldn't help but notice that Han had never shown interest in her flowers, nor had he even noticed them. She decided not to dwell on these matters for now, as they were too complicated. As she absent-mindedly lifted her sleeve, she noticed the embroidery on her robe, which revealed the owner of the clothing and the mansion. Meanwhile, Han, having punched the wall in frustration, tried to calm himself but couldn't stop thinking about Rielle in his robe. The image of her wearing his clothes while not walking around in wet ones made him feel increasingly embarrassed, especially since it reminded him of a possible future marriage, where she would wear his robes. Han recalled his childhood in this mansion. How, as a young boy, he had been exiled here after being removed from the palace. His abilities had developed too quickly and strongly, which had caused concern among the royal family. Despite being compared unfavorably to his brother, who was destined to become king, Han had been sent away to live in this mansion, where he would remain for many years. The only good thing about being here was meeting the Duchess Hoson, who had been terrifying at first, but whom Han had eventually come to know. Shaking off the memories, Han decided to find something to take with him when he returned to the room. Rielle had nearly fallen asleep by the fire, and he was relieved to see her peaceful expression. He began to justify his absence when she suddenly asked if this was truly his mansion. Han was taken aback, but Rielle showed him the initials embroidered on her robe. He hadn't realized his name was on the clothing, but he didn't deny that he had lived here as a child. Rielle immediately began to ask him about his childhood in this mansion, and Han, sitting down next to her, agreed to tell her a story while her clothes dried. Rielle loved stories in any form, especially those about Monsieur Hoson, whom Han had known. Han explained that before arriving at this mansion, he had met Hoson, but their connection had been limited to mere greetings. Rielle, still surprised by how long Han had known the Duchess, was curious to know more, but Han chose not to go into details about her volatile character. Time passed quickly, and as evening fell, Rielle began to feel sleepy. Han, who had been telling stories enthusiastically, hadn't noticed how quiet she had become. Turning toward her, he realized she had fallen asleep, snoring peacefully. He quietly approached her, covering her with a blanket and checking her clothes to ensure they were dry. However, Han still had wet spots on his clothes and decided to remove them to dry while Rielle continued to sleep. The difficulty was that the stones Han usually relied on to dry things were temporarily blocked. As he removed his clothes, Han was unaware that he stood in front of the still sleeping Rielle in an almost bare state. She turned in her sleep, causing the blanket to fall off, but continued to sleep. Han, hoping she wouldn't wake up, decided to cover her again. But just as he did, a loud thunderclap caused Rielle to jump up, screaming. Han froze in embarrassment, realizing that he had been caught in an incredibly awkward position. Rielle, now fully awake, blushed deeply upon realizing what had happened. She waved her hands frantically, trying to explain the situation, while Han himself was just as embarrassed. Both of them apologized at the same time, though it had been an accident. Surprised by the situation, they stared at each other in silence before Han awkwardly explained that he had only meant to cover her after her blanket had fallen. Rielle, still flustered, listened calmly, but then gently covered Han with a towel to help him relax. She invited him to sit next to her and dry off completely, promising to watch over the horses until the rain stopped. Han, exhausted, agreed and lay down, but Rielle asked him to rest while she kept an eye on things. Though still embarrassed, the two tried to ignore the awkwardness. When they returned to Rielle's mansion, Nia greeted them angrily. The Archduke couldn't offer any excuses for their delay, since the storm had been caused by the activation of his stone. Nia was furious, but Rielle stepped in to defend Han, assuring the assistant that the rain had been an accident. Though initially upset, Nia eventually calmed down after confirming that the Archduke had not forced Rielle into anything. Rielle continued to defend Han, explaining that he had helped her greatly on her journey. Once the rain stopped, they decided it was too late to return, so they waited until the morning to leave. Although a small scandal erupted at the mansion, it eventually calmed down, and Rielle returned to her usual duties. However, since the trip, Rielle had been quietly observing Han, wondering what he was thinking, but whenever she caught his gaze, he quickly turned away. Confused, she didn't ask any questions but quietly kept her distance, though she didn't like how the Archduke seemed to be avoiding her. Still, she pretended not to care. Meanwhile, everything reached a point where Han became too busy for joint dinners at the mansion. Once again, the lady found herself eating alone, only accompanied by Nia. Deciding not to dwell on it, Riella went to the flower shop, and Han called his assistant almost immediately. Nia, sensing tension, expressed her displeasure about approaching the Archduke since they didn't get along well. Without saying a word, Han placed a box on the table and asked her to take it. The assistant was taken aback when he realized it was a box from the Archduke containing one of his stones. He was confused about why Han was giving it to her. Han explained that he had received permission for Nia to use it within the palace to protect her mistress. He added that he needed to leave for a while and wanted to ensure Riella's safety in his absence. Surprised, the assistant asked if this meant Han was finally entering the room of stones, and Han, with a serious expression, confirmed that he would open the first room in 2 weeks. Later, Han asked his assistant Pooh if he was able to acquire all the stones the Archduke had requested. Pooh bowed his head apologetically, admitting that several stones had been denied to him, and he couldn't retrieve them. However, Han had anticipated this, and instructed him to bring Spannel as a substitute for the stone the Queen had withheld. Once the task was completed, Han placed 2 stones on a cloth. One was Spannel, and the other was a related stone. The latter was called related because it copied the power of the crystal next to it. Sometimes the abilities of the related stone were opposite, which balanced the powers of both crystals. Though using the royal stone was impossible, Han had no choice but to rely on the related stone, even though it was a risky endeavor. The likelihood of the related stone being activated was very low, and Han was already considering how to make it work as needed. Time was running out before the room of stones opened, and Han knew he had to proceed cautiously. Riella's safety was his top priority, followed by the opening of the room containing her inheritance. Just the day before, Han had warned Riella that he would return to his palace to prepare for the opening of the first door, and that he hoped she would warmly welcome him upon his return. Riella had agreed without question, and Han, though slightly embarrassed by her words, tried to hide his feelings. A week had passed since that conversation, and Riella was now at peace, quietly sipping tea in her chambers. The flower shop had passed inspection for the festival, and she was happy with the progress. However, despite the success, Riella felt incredibly bored. Nia noticed this and commented on how tired she seemed, but Riella quickly reassured her that she was fine. To lift Riella's spirits, Nia suggested they go for a walk. Although Riella was initially hesitant, Nia persuaded her, explaining that, thanks to Han's arrangements, she could now protect her mistress at any time. So they set out for the day, determined to enjoy themselves. When they arrived in the city, Riella was in awe of the beauty surrounding them. She regretted that they hadn't ventured out sooner, as she was already having so much fun. She dragged Nia into a clothing store and decided to buy her a red ribbon, which she thought suited Nia's deep black hair perfectly. The assistant was flustered by the compliment and asked if it really looked good. Riella explained that the colour red suited Nia, but her own light brown hair wasn't a good match for such a ribbon. Suddenly, Nia's mood shifted as she became downcast, remembering something unpleasant. Riella sensed there was more to the story and pressed her for an answer. Nia admitted that she didn't like black, but she didn't elaborate further. Riella, trying to change the subject, asked Nia to name her favourite colour, but Nia replied that she didn't have one. The conversation shifted, and Nia confessed that this was her first time shopping and she was enjoying it. To cheer Riella up even more, Nia decided to buy as many things as possible, loading a basket with clothes. Later, when the girls had nearly emptied the store, the owner came to see them off and invited them back. Riella laughed, acknowledging that they might have bought too much, but Nia dismissed it with a cheerful attitude. However, the bags were cumbersome, so Riella suggested they take them to the carriage. Nia quickly found it, much to Riella's surprise, and ran off to retrieve the packages. While waiting on the bench, Riella enjoyed the beautiful weather. Suddenly she heard a commotion behind her. A child was crying and a woman was scolding her daughter for breaking flowers. The woman was upset because the flowers were meant for an important guest. Riella turned to investigate, intrigued by the noise. As she observed the scene, she realized that the woman's anger stemmed not only from the broken flowers, but also from a deeper misunderstanding, and she quickly deduced the situation.